we ready? Do you have the bikes? No, no, at the moment no. Sorry. How are you? Ciao, come stai? Tonino, tutto bene? Quello sì che è un cappello. Ciao, sono bene. Ciao. Tutto bene, beh, stiamo per iniziare la sfilata.
Vedo.
Direi cazzo.
Bisogna fare onore, no? È un bel caldo, vero?
Io sono qui per 3 ore. L'altra volta c'è la signora del Selectric che aveva bisogno urgente di te. Come stai? Sì. La signora, va detto, sì. Mario, good afternoon. Simon.
Simon, good afternoon.
How are you?
Good, I'm good.
I'm going to introduce you as the former head of the BMW Formula One team and now the deputy chairman of FIFA. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Hello, 1, 2. Testing, check.
Girls on film.
You think it's possible to put the one of Ferrari?
Buongiorno, buongiorno. Do we have sound? Signore e signori, buongiorno e benvenuti a Villa d'Este per il concorso di eleganza edizione 2018. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and a very warm, literally warm welcome to Villa d'Este for the 2018 Concours d'Elegance. Now, we have assembled, as every year, 50 of the world's most beautiful motor cars, which we'd like to show you this afternoon. Cars which represent 110 years of motoring history. But before we start that parade, I'd like to invite my colleague Roberto Razia dal Polo here. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, Roberto.
Yes, congratulations.
Roberto.
Simon. Hello, hi.
Hi, ciao, Roberto. Roberto is in charge of the motorcycle concours, which is taking place today and tomorrow morning at nearby Villa Erba, just a couple of kilometers along the lake.
Very close from here, and I'm very glad to be here with you and to meet you again, you two. From my side, good afternoon and warm welcome to Villa d'Este. It's nice to speak with you about, in a couple of minutes, about motorcycle, because this is really famous in all the world, like a concours of cars. But BMW, you know, it's very strong also on 2 wheels. And so tomorrow morning, motorcycles will be protagonists at Villa Erba.
So tell us a little bit about that. And I know that you have I think we can call it a motorcycle amuse-bouche lined up for us in just a minute. But We have how many motorcycles tomorrow at Villa Erba?
Yeah, we have more than 25 motorcycles, and they are already wonderful, but just 15 will be chosen by a marvelous jury, and they will token to the red carpet in front of the public. And so the finalists will have one winner for each category. We will have 5 categories during the different epochas, and one best of show voted by the jury, like you, and one best of show voted by the public referendum.
So talking of juries, before we start the motorcycle or indeed the car parade, allow me to introduce you, please, to the ladies and gentlemen of this year's jury. President of the jury now for many years and familiar to most of you, Lorenzo Ramacciotti from Italy. Lorenzo is the former head of Pininfarina. He is also the former head of Ferrari Design, and he has been the chairman of the jury here for, I won't say how many years, but quite a few, 15. Now, in no particular order, on Lorenzo's left, Harm Lagai, former Porsche chief designer. Many of Porsche's current models still bear his fingerprints. Next to him, honorary judge for this year, Mario Tisen, former head of the BMW Formula One team, and now enjoying a rather quieter role as the deputy chairman of FIFA. All the way from Arizona, USA, dude, the very tall Winston Goodfellow. Don't ask me how he manages to get into Italian sports cars, but Winston is a great writer and automotive historian. Next to Winston, Quirina Laumann, one of Europe's leading lady collectors and historic rally drivers, fresh from her 20th Mille Miglia participation last weekend at the wheel of a Mercedes SSK, no less. Another honorary judge for this year, no less than Sir Johnny Ive, who is the design director of something many of you have in your pockets, Apple. A man who knows more about design than most of us can ever hope to aspire to. At the end, Adolfo Orsi, from the family that used to own Maserati for many, many years. Adolfo is a renowned Italian automotive historian and can I say, a researcher as well. He's the man, if you own something incredibly obscure that nobody else can tell you anything about, he probably knows the answer to your questions on its history. Ian Cameron on Lorenzo's right, Scottish, English, former Rolls-Royce design director, and he tells me that his current occupation, as described by his wife, is just hanging around and enjoying life. Patrick Le Quément, the former design director of Renault, now an independent designer, and he's also turned his hands to super yachts. Should you be inspired by the lake today, he can build you something to cruise with, although more ocean-going than lake-going. Stefano Pasini from Bologna in Italy, one of the great Lamborghini experts, and not only Lamborghinis, but Stefano is an ophthalmologist by training. In his spare time, he is an automotive historian and also a novelist. And at the very end, and by no means least, Yasmin Le Bon, who describes herself as a classic model. And if the surname sounds familiar, it's because cheering from the side, we have her husband, Simon Le Bon, who belongs to an organization called Duran Duran, that some of you might have heard of. He's usually the one holding the microphone. We have Franco Daudo as the secretary to the jury. And we should also thank Alessandra Giorgetti, who now, I think for the 20th year, has been keeping the whole show on the road as the person who makes sure that everything flows seamlessly.
It's working. It's working. Okay. Thank you very much. Saluti a tutti.
The sound is working. Yeah. Now, I'm sure I've forgotten somebody, but there is time for more thanks at the end. Lapo Elkan is with us in spirit, but not physically. He is apparently... Lapo is apparently, well, otherwise indisposed. Paolo Tuminelli, an Italian design critic and journalist, is still, I think, inspecting some of the cars for the final verdict. And in the final empty chair, who am I forgetting, Yasmin? Lapo. Allora, Roberto, ci fai vedere qualche moto?
Yes, I can tell you something about some motorcycle. The oldest one is 1907. 1970 is really something special. Before the First World War, and it was an Indian, the first Indian with 2 cylinders. So we have literally all the history of 2 wheels, but one category is dedicated to the sidecar. So not only 4 wheels, not only 2, but 3 wheels. So I think tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock in Villa Erba, you will have the possibility to appreciate all types of vehicle and the cars too.
Kai, if you'd like, Kai is the head of our service team, and he does a great job. His day job, by the way, is as an undercover cop with the Munich drug squad, so this, for him, is a walk in the park. Kai, if you would like to get the motorcycles ready, we will receive them in just a moment.
You say, okay.
Now, whilst we're waiting for those bikes to come, I will just remind you we have 50 cars here today, divided into 8 classes. The judges are divided into 4 groups, and their job is to choose from each class the most historically interesting, the most beautiful, the most special car. There's also a runner-up in each class. And tomorrow evening, the best of show will be awarded for the fairest of them all. And that car will also receive a specially made one-off Lange und Söhne wristwatch, which nobody else in the world has.
Here
Roberto,
we are.
The wild
Ladies
ones.
and gentlemen, a motorcycle parade this year too in Villa d'Este to open the cars concours. Fantastic one. You can appreciate also the clothes and the smile on the rider. Hello.
And I believe you are Andreas Martin.
Yes, I am.
Andreas, good afternoon. Now, you're the designer of this new BMW concept motorcycle, is that right?
Yes, I am. That's right.
Tell us a little bit about it.
It's a dynamic sport adventure bike.
A dynamic sports adventure bike.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
It combines actually the best of all the worlds. Let's say sport bikes, adventure bikes, and touring bikes.
And is this something we're likely to ever see in production? I know we have a lot of bikers here today who'll want to know that.
Well, I sure hope so.
And the name of it is called the Novecento?
That's right. It's called the Novecento.
So no prizes for guessing the engine size.
No, I'm not going to talk about it.
It's all a secret. And behind you, you have a sample, I believe,
You have
Roberto.
some marvelous BMW special edition, also the red one you see at the last. Very special one with some details, not very frequent to use. Pay attention, ladies and gentlemen. And one sidecar and one sidecar. So you have in few motorcycles, and this Harley Davidson 1917 is really fantastic restore.
Roberto, you are giving us a tasting menu of what people can expect tomorrow at Villa Erba, right?
Yes, absolutely. And so
Great.
we are ready if you want to go on with
That's
your
great.
concourse.
Andreas, thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas.
Great looking bike. Gentlemen, the road is yours. I love the helmets.
Yes, the helmet
Very
is fantastic. Yeah.
Easy rider.
For a riding motorcycle, and this is have a special value because working on the road.
I'm just looking at how much his
Incredible.
headlamp is vibrating and wondering what use that is at night.
Voila.
There we go, the wild ones. Roberto, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
If you'd
Have
like
a
to
nice afternoon, Simon.
Thank you very much,
Good
Roberto.
job.
Ci vediamo domani.
Bye
Grazie.
bye. The jury to everyone. Bye bye.
Ecco quindi un'anteprima delle moto che potrete ammirare domani a Villa Erba. E adesso iniziamo la sfilata delle vetture storiche per il 2018. First up, as is of course traditional, Ulrich Knieps, the head of the BMW Museum, with Danilo Zucchetti, the managing director of Villa d'Este Hotels. And of course, what could they be driving? Good afternoon, Paolo Tominelli. Ciao, Paolo. The juror who is missing. But a BMW 507, that absolute classic designed by Count Goertz, who used to be a visitor here at the Concorso d'Eleganza. An absolute masterpiece of design and perhaps arguably the most famous of all post-war BMWs. Ulrich, you are the patron of the Concours d'Elegance. How many concours has it been for you now?
Well, it's my 8th concours in a row. And I have to say, each concours is getting better and better and better.
What is it that you particularly like about the Villa d'Este concours above the other events that you take part in during the course of the year?
Well, I've been to many concourses, but I would say, first of all, this fantastic setting here, you never find anywhere in the world. Secondly, we have only 50 cars here, which guarantees to a certain extent certain exclusivities. And of course, all the entrants and friends of Concorso who make it every year. Thank you to everybody who is coming to join us here. Without you, this wouldn't work at all.
And thank you. Without you, it wouldn't work either. So it's a winning combination. Danilo, you are, well, you're a lucky man that you can call this place home. How have you seen the Concorso di Eleganza evolve over the years that you have been involved with it?
Ma sappiamo tutti che questa è l'89esima edizione del concorso, quindi il concorso nacque come concorso per auto nuove, perché a quell'epoca l'auto era stata appena inventata, quindi diciamo che mantiene quello spirito di non essere solo un evento di auto d'epoca, bensì di guardare al futuro con questi prototipi, queste innovazioni, e sicuramente BMW in questo ha un grande merito. Quest'anno un'edizione speciale sicuramente, anche per via del motto. C'è un legame fortissimo con Hollywood on the Lake, tra il nostro lago, Villa d'Este, che oggi devo dire è la vera protagonista, perché celebra il 450° anno dalla sua fondazione, quindi è veramente un simbolo di un'eterna eleganza e siamo molto fieri di questo.
Danilo, grazie. That's quite something. If I can just translate, although Danilo does speak perfect English, this is the 450th year that Villa d'Este has existed. The Concours itself has existed since 1929, and what sets Villa d'Este apart from other automotive events, and there are some great events in the world, but this is arguably the most exclusive of all of them, but it's also the one that remains faithful to that tradition of the Concours d'Elegance, which is not just about looking back in history, and we're going to do that in a moment, but we also look forwards in the way that this Concours did when it was founded in 1929. It was an opportunity, almost like a fashion catwalk for motorcars, for the latest creations of the designers to be showcased to the public for the very first time. And apart from the historic cars that you'll see today, there are also the concepts that are displayed over here. If you haven't looked at them, please do. And they will be parading tomorrow. So, of course, we look back into the past for the great designs of the past, but we look forward as well to see what the motor cars of tomorrow might look like. Ulrich, Danilo, thank you both very much, and we look forward to seeing you later on. Grazie. 450 years. That's an impressive CV. Kai, I think we are ready for the first of the contenders. Send it on, please. Now think of today as a time machine, and we're going right back in time now to 1909. 109 years ago, this was considered absolutely state-of-the-art. Harold, so you turn it off with a button with which your foot presses. If you're reaching for the clutch and you get that by mistake, it could be rather awkward, couldn't it? This is what the future looked like in 1909. An Isotta Fraschini, a car that was built not far from here in Milan. Look at how simple this car is by today's standards. Nothing to cover the wheels, no wings, not even a windscreen, no doors, no hood. It really is the motor car reduced to the bare essentials. And yet, despite its Spartan appearance, this was a revolutionary motor car, because until that time, cars had looked very much like horse-drawn carriages without the horses. Isotta Fraschini was always a brand for the fortunate few, and the first owner of this car, if I remember correctly, was a young graduate of Yale University in America, and this car spent almost all of its life in New York. Now, Harold, who despite his young years has a car that is over a century old, was given a motor car book as a 14-year-old that had this car on the cover. You looked for the car for 35 years, and then you finally found it and were able to buy it, and you've brought it here to Villa d'Este today, to its home place for the first time in, I'm guessing, decades. Thank you very much. It's a great-looking car, and it's a great car with which to open today's parade. Thank you. The period advertising for Isotta talked about
Simon,
The Promise of Pleasure. And you are receiving your participants medal from Ralf Huber, the head of BMW Tradition, and Dominic Fischlin, the FIFA steward in charge here and also one of the selecting committee members. So you can tell everybody back home, yes, I was there. Now there's a very brave man with a starting handle to help you to get it running again. Success first time, well done. And there he goes with The Promise of Pleasure in the 1909 Isotta Fraschini. Now fast forward just 16 years and look how cars have progressed. Ettore Bugatti was an Italian who set up shop in France. Good afternoon. Philippe Cornet de Rollsroyce. You can turn off the engine. We'll give you a push afterwards. Ettore Bugatti came from a very creative family. His brother Rembrandt was a sculptor. His uncle Carlo made Art Nouveau furniture. So it was perhaps inevitable that Ettore himself would have some artistic leanings. He started designing cars for other manufacturers and then set up on his own just after the First World War. He was always obsessed with horses. He loved riding around the outskirts of his factory on a horse, and hence the horseshoe radiator, which became a very distinctive Bugatti feature. Other details here, you can notice how the front wheels have this negative camber. They stick out at the top. This particular Bugatti was designed for endurance racing, which is why it has two spare wheels rather than the normal one. But there's really nothing superfluous. It's just the car reduced to the essential elements. It was also one of the first cars in history to feature alloy wheels, which at the time it came out in 1924 were considered revolutionary. And this particular car had a successful career racing in the factory team. And then, as was fairly common practice at the time, the factory just gave it a new coat of paint and sold it to an unsuspecting Swiss client, which is why it's painted white and red, as a brand new car. And I was reading something the other day, an American journalist fairly recently said, sitting in a Bugatti Type 35 makes the rest of the world suck, which I thought was a fairly good description. And having done the Mille Miglia in one of these cars last week, I can confirm that it is pretty cool to be in the car, but if you're my size, it takes a while to get in and out. But great looking car, iconic car. Philippe, good to see you, good to have you here. And we have once again your participants medal and certificate from Ralf Huber and Dominic Fischlin. This model, the Type 35, was the most successful Bugatti racing car of all. And can you believe that it won over 1,000 races in the 1920s? Bugatti Type 35, Grand Prix car for the road, Philippe Rohini. Thank you. Now, great sports cars weren't the preserve of only Ettore Bugatti in the late 1920s. His great rival from Italy was the Alfa Romeo, and here we have the 6C 1750 Alfa Romeo of Luca Bergamaschi from Italy. Buongiorno Luca, perfetto così, va. Perfetto. Se vuoi spegnere. In the late 1920s, if you were a young man about town, especially in Italy, this was the car that you aspired to own. Alfa Romeo was a brand that had been around since before the First World War. The Alfa stands for Anonima Fabbrica Lombarda Automobili, or that slightly reversed, I should say, which basically means a Lombardy company making cars. Romeo was added afterwards when Nicola Romeo, a young entrepreneur, bought the company, and they made some of the greatest sports cars between the two wars. The designer of this particular car was a man called Vittorio Jano, originally born as Viktor János in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He went to Fiat initially and designed a world championship winning racing car there. He was poached by Alfa Romeo, and this was one of his first designs. The 1750, like this car, was raced extensively, and it excelled in road events like the Mille Miglia. In fact, it won the Mille Miglia twice in the late 1920s with drivers like Campari and Nuvolari. The 1750 was also raced by a rather less well-known driver, a burly man with a prominent nose from the Modena area. He achieved some not bad results, but he soon distinguished himself running cars for other people, managing cars for other people, and eventually set up his own racing team. And that man's name was Enzo Ferrari. If you notice, by the way, the three headlight covers here, this was for those long-distance road races where you had a lot of stones and so forth that were prone to kick up from the car in front of you and smash the headlights if you weren't careful. So they would have these covers during the daytime to protect them. They're rounded, which is an attempt at aerodynamics, and then for the evening they would take those off to race through the night. Coach work on this car, incidentally, is Zagato. Zagato is a company we'll be seeing more of later on today. It's another great Milanese brand that had made their name in the First World War, making bodies for aeroplanes. So they were specialized in very lightweight coachwork, which of course suited these cars very well. Now, as you will have guessed by now, there is an entrance prize and a certificate from Ralf Huber and Dominic Fischlin. And this car, in fact, I'm looking on the side of the car. It raced in the 1932 Mille Miglia with Gazzabini and the 1934 Mille Miglia with Giuseppe Cortese, who was a well-known racing driver with the nickname Fiorello. Grazie.
Simon, I just want to add something about the engine. It's gone. Dopo. Domani, yes. No,
now we fast forward just 2 or 3 years, and that same car that you have just seen has morphed into this, the Alfa Romeo 8C2300, and what a difference 2 cylinders and 550 cc of displacement make. Now, I want you to listen to this car as it comes by, because in my opinion it has one of the best sounds of any car here today. Roderick Jack from London with the Alfa Romeo 8C. That's perfect. Silence. I preferred the sound. Roderick Jack with this magnificent 8C 2.3 Monza, and it's called the Monza because the first major race that this model won was at the Autodromo di Monza just outside Milan, where in fact the Italian Grand Prix had been moved to from Brescia just a few years earlier. Vittorio Jano took the car that you've just seen. He made the engine bigger. He made the car a little bit lower. He gave it even more sporty coachwork. And he came up with what has to be, for most people, the ultimate pre-war driver's car. You could consider this a Formula One car for the road. It's a car that is capable of nearly 200 kilometers an hour. And I have to say, Roderick drives it as it was intended. He passed me last weekend like I was standing still on the Mille Miglia. And here you are just a week later in the proper tradition of a gentleman driver in a Concours d'Elegance after just a quick wipe over with an oily rag. Very, very impressive. This car, when it was new, cost 58,000 lira, and it was sold, as you might have guessed by the color, to the UK, which was a big market for gentleman drivers competing in places like Brooklands and Shelsley Walsh and so on. And it was sold to an Englishman called the Honourable Brian Lewis. He was the son of Lord Essendon, and this was one of his first major racing cars. In some races, I've seen the period shots of this car, in some races the organisers obliged you to have a co-driver, which is not really what you want in terms of weight. So he was quite clever. He employed a dwarf for that purpose who couldn't even see over the windscreen. And if you see how little space there is in the passenger seat, as your wife knows, you'll understand the logic of thinking creatively. But the car was owned later on, after the war, by another person who I'd like to just tell you a little bit about. As you will have guessed already, it's the human interest stories of these cars that really make them come alive. And this car, in the 1960s and 70s and even the 1980s, was owned by a pioneering English collector called the Honourable Patrick Lindsay. As you can see, there are a lot of the honourables in all these stories. The honourable is what you are when you're the son of a lord. When your dad dies, you become the lord and your son becomes the honourable. But anyway, Patrick Lindsay, who came from an ancient Scottish family, bought this car in the 60s as just a second-hand old racing car that nobody particularly wanted, and he drove it extensively. He raced it, he drove it on the road, he would take it to race meetings. He was a great character, he was also a very skilled pilot, and one of his day job was as an auctioneer with Christie's, and I'll never forget Christie's staff panicking that the auctioneer hadn't turned up yet when they heard a noise overhead and the auctioneer landed on the lawn in his Spitfire. How cool is that? And you're continuing the tradition. Roderick, your award by Ralf Huber and Dominic Fischlin for your Alfa Monza.
Simon, just to add that the engine is a 8-cylinder inline, is a blown engine, and you can recognize the blowing by the whistle from the engine.
That's a very good point, Franco. Yes, when you hear this engine, you'll hear it's got this basso profundo sound, which is the straight 8, which is a very unusual configuration, and a little whistling that you'll hear over that, which is the supercharger, which forces the petrol into the engine and increases the power. But if there was a prize for the best sounding car, I have to say, personally, I'd be inclined to give it to this. Rod, I won't keep you any longer. Thank you very much. I told you so. That is the dog's proverbials. And now another connoisseur and another very special car. Designer Mark Newson with the Bugatti Type 59. Great, Mark. Wow. What do you do if you're a young British aristocrat racing an Alfa Monza and you want a car for the next season? Well, this is the answer. Brian Lewis, having raced that car in, I think, 1934, received this car from Bugatti for the 1935 season. This was really Bugatti's last hooray in racing cars. We saw the Type 35 a few minutes ago. That's a car from the mid-1920s, the roaring 20s. Here we're very much into the 1930s. And Bugatti, despite his creativity, was actually quite a conservative designer. He believed in the status quo. You'll notice this car still has cable-operated brakes, which even by the mid-1930s was considered to be very old-fashioned. But some of the design details are exquisite on this car. Consider that Ettore Bugatti was funded by his private bankers. His German rivals, Mercedes and Auto Union, were funded by this time by the government, and it was, of course, a losing battle. We all know that in motorsport, even then, you need a lot of money. You need to start with a very large amount of money to finish with a very small amount of money to be successful. Mark, you're a celebrated designer, and I'm fascinated by the fact that you were drawn to this car, because as a can I say, relatively young man, this is clearly quite an old car. Why this car?
Well, thank you, Simon, for calling me a young man. Well, I grew up being aware of this car, which I think is quite an unusual thing for such an old car. I think it's safe to say that the older you get, the more, in a sense, that your taste sort of goes back in time. But you know, I'd been aware of this car for I think since I was in my early teenage years. And in particular, certain details.
Which details in particular drew you to this car?
Well, I think that, you know, the most obvious details are probably the wheels. They're the things that I remember the most. But practically every aspect of this car, because it was built as a, well, typically in a Bugatti fashion, but it's really... it's built like a piece of jewelry. If you look at the way the car's made, you know, everything is machined extremely precisely. There's nothing agricultural about this car. It's very, very sophisticated. It's very refined, even although, as you say, perhaps slightly old-fashioned for its era, and maybe it was the sort of the last gasp of Bugatti in the Grand Prix arena. Nevertheless, I was always aware that it was such an iconic object, you know, in its entirety, and that was the thing that I still absolutely adore about the car.
And I have to say, it's great to see you using it. You were on the Mille Miglia with this car last year. It was one of the most sculptural cars on the Mille Miglia, and you finished. You got to the end.
Yes, not only did we finish, but my wife claims to this day that she's my co-driver, or was my co-driver, that it's the most comfortable car she'd ever done the Mille Miglia in. In fact, she fell asleep in this car for 3 hours while I was driving.
To have said that, it must have been her first Mille Miglia.
No, it was actually her 6th or 7th, yeah.
Mark, thank you very much. It's great to have you here with us, and thank you for sharing the Type 59 Bugatti, your medal and your certificate. I'm not sure where you're going to put them in there, but where there's a will, there's a way, right? Mark Newson with the Bugatti Type 59. They made just 8 of these cars. Only 8 were ever built. Half of those cars were sold to England, where they were raced by gentlemen drivers. This is one of those cars, the Honourable Brian Lewis's Type 59 Bugatti. As it goes by, just look at, as Mark says, the attention to detail in this car, the riveted spine, the twin fillers, the way the chassis is all drilled, but above all, the wheels, which are the most iconic detail of this car. They're known as piano wire wheels because of the thin spokes. Mark, great looking car. Thanks again. And you can hear the whine of the supercharger of that car as well. Now we've done France, we've done Italy. Let's have England, and representing England all the way from Yorkshire and trying to run me over is, should I say Aop? Aop. All the way from Yorkshire with love. Doesn't that just roll off the tongue? Jonathan Turner with the Triumph Dolomite, which was the British challenger to the Alfa Romeo 8C. Donald Healy was a rally driver and an engineer that many of you will have heard of, obviously father of the Healy sporting dynasty. His son Geoffrey went on to make the Austin Healy. But Donald Healy, together with Tommy Wisdom, who was a well-known racing driver and motoring journalist, had the idea of creating a British rival to the Italian and French sports cars of the 1930s. What did they do? They arranged an appointment to go and see the Alfa Romeo factory. They met up with the top brass, who were very excited. They thought that they were going to buy an 8C Alfa Romeo. Instead, what did they do? They went home and built their own. This is the car. The chassis number DMH1, Donald Healy's initials, tells you a little bit about who the father of the car was. But they never enjoyed commercial success. There just wasn't the appetite at the time. It was the mid-1930s. Money was tight after the Great Depression, and so just 3 of these cars, I think, were built. This was the only one that was competed originally, and it was entered for the 1935 Monte Carlo Rally, which they didn't complete because they were driving to the start of the Monte Carlo Rally, and they tried to beat a train to get across a level crossing. And needless to say, the train won. They tend to when you're in a car. So the remains of the car were shipped back home, rebuilt, and they were back the following year to take part in the rally when they came 8th overall. But this is one of just 3 Triumph Dolomite 8Cs ever built. Jonathan has restored it to its former glory, and this is the first time I think it's ever been in Italy before. So, Jonathan, thanks very much. Great to have you here. Cheers.
I remember that Triumph will use again the Dolomite name in the 70s. You remember?
Yes.
Yeah.
As Franco says, yes, Dolomite is a name that Triumph revived to one of their models in the 1970s. Jonathan Turner with the Triumph Dolomite. Now remaining in England, but with an even more exotic name, the Lagonda LG45 of Andreas Pohl from Germany. And this is entirely coincidence, but this particular car was also raced by the Honourable Brian Lewis in the 1930s. That's wonderful. Just there, it's perfect. Thank you very much. I guess young English aristocrats with lots of money and lots of spare time racing cars is nothing new, and that was certainly the case back then. Lagonda, despite the fact that it sounds in some way perhaps Italian, is actually a very British brand. Well, a very British brand founded by an American just outside of London in the years between the two world wars. His name was Wilbur Gunn. He came to England hoping to pursue a career as an opera singer. When that didn't work out, of course, logically, he decided to build sports cars. And he named the Lagonda after the Lagonda River near where he came from in Ohio. The company went bust in 1920. It was bought by an English solicitor called Alan Good. He was a great believer in motorsport as a way of promoting the cars and helping sales. And it wasn't the last time that Lagonda went bust. That has continued on several occasions until relatively recent years. But Lagonda, despite that, achieved some prominent sporting successes, culminating in a win at Le Mans in 1935. EPE 97, it's known by its registration, is one of the most famous and successful of all Lagonda racing cars. This car was a familiar face at Brooklands in the 1930s, where the slogan was "the right crowd and no crowding." Could have been coined for Villa d'Este. You have your participants' awards from Ralf Huber and Dominic Fischlin for this very famous Lagonda LG45 Rapide. He incidentally, the Lagonda brand, Alan Good, recruited W.O. Bentley, the founder of Bentley Motor Cars, to be the technical director of his company after W.O. Bentley's company had gone bankrupt at the beginning of the 1930s. And so he was the designer of the mechanical elements of this car, Mr. Bentley. Thank you very much. Now, talking of W.O. Bentley, undoubtedly one of the most famous car designers in history, Walter Owen Bentley, to give him his full title. This was one of the first cars to come out of the Bentley factory. And if I tell you that W.O. Bentley trained as a railway engineer, you won't be surprised perhaps that his cars were not known for being small and compact. Bentleys were, as they are now, large, powerful, and expensive. And I think that's probably why Maurits van Soen likes them so much, because you're a great rallyist and you love enjoying your cars. Now, I think we can turn the engine off, by the way, Maurits, if you don't mind. W.O. Bentley started building cars in 1919, just after the First World War. And his cars, in a fairly short space of time, achieved great success with the wealthy, sporting gentleman type client between the two world wars. But of course, like so many other brands, his company was hit severely by the Wall Street crash at the end of the 1920s. And in 1931, the company was sold to Rolls-Royce, who bid for it anonymously to buy it from out of bankruptcy. W.O. Bentley's cars were always built to be high-speed express cars. They were built to last. They were built to be comfortable. They were known by their great rival, Mr. Bugatti, as the fastest trucks in the world. They, rather like Bugattis, they weren't known for stopping, but they were known for lasting. And they won the Le Mans 24-hour race for so many years in the 1920s that Le Mans became known in England as a British holiday organized for us by the French. Now, this particular car was bodied by a company called Jarvis. Bear in mind that in the 1920s, with luxury cars, you didn't go to a manufacturer and ask them to supply you a brand new car. All that you got from a manufacturer, whether it was Bentley or Rolls-Royce, was just a bare chassis and an engine and a steering wheel. The rest, you had to go to an independent coach builder, rather like you might go to a tailor, and tell them exactly what you wanted, which is why almost no two cars are the same. Jarvis was a UK coach builder who created the body for this car, and it's quite unusual for a Bentley. This was a style that was more popular on the continent or in America because it has this second windscreen. It's what we call a boat tail tourer because of the pointy tail. And you can see it's beautifully made with all this wooden decking. Not perhaps the most comfortable car for entrance and exit, but the person sitting in the back in this case was not normally the one who'd paid the bill to buy the car, so that was a secondary consideration. Ralph, Dominic?
Simon, now is my time, because this car is the winning of the first special prize by the jury, because this is the car driven from farthest away. So it's come from far away, from much more than the others.
Quindi questa vettura vince il premio per la macchina guidata da più lontano, premia Enrico Gelpi.
Yes, it's a Trofeo Automobile Club di Como, is introduced by Enrico Gelpi, the president of
so
the
I think
ACI
a round
Como.
of applause for the car that was driven from the furthest, if you don't mind, ladies and gentlemen. Congratulations to Maurits van Son, who, as I said earlier, believes in using his cars the way they were intended. Great to see a car like this still being used on the road in the spirit of the Bentley boys. Thank you, Maurits. Now, you can wait, as they say about London buses, you can wait years to see one of them and then three come along at the same time. In this case, I'm talking about Isotta Fraschini's. And the first car that opened the parade today was the very early Isotta, the little red car, the FENC model. Here we're fast-forwarding 20 years, and this is really the culmination of what Isotta Fraschini was all about. It occupies just about all of the mosaic. That's lovely. Mikhail Opengem, all the way from Russia, with the Isotta Fraschini Tipo 8A SS. The SS stands for Super Spinto, or Super Tuned. It's the fastest Isotta Fraschini you could buy, and just about the fastest motor car that money could buy. As I said earlier, it's a firm that came from Milan. The bodies on most of these cars were built by a company called Castagna, also from Milan, and they were a favorite with everybody from Pope Pius XI to Rudolph Valentino in Hollywood. They covered the whole range of the moral spectrum, we might say. Cars like this starred in movies. They were a familiar sight on Wall Street. And this particular car has come back to Italy today for the first time in 80 years. So it's wonderful to welcome the car back to its home country after an 8-decade sojourn abroad. The New York showroom of Isotta Fraschini, by the way, was in Manhattan, of course, and the lead salesman was none other than Ugo D'Annunzio, who was the brother of the famous poet and writer Gabriele D'Annunzio. So they didn't do things by halves. They employed the creme de la creme of society to sell them. They had the most beautiful premises to do so, and yet, like so many luxury cars of that period, the Wall Street crash, the Great Depression, really sounded the death knell for cars of this type. But this car in particular was sold new to the Willis family of Illinois, who had no fewer than 7 Isottas. So they certainly did their part to keep the company afloat. Thank you very much. Great looking car, I have to say, in all of its splendor. Incidentally, the Spirit of Triumph mascot was something that Isotta was known for. This was really the golden era of car mascots, which were a way of personalizing your car. But if you think that car mascots were something new with the motor car, you'd be mistaken. In fact, the crested sun falcon mascot was graced the chariot of King Tutankhamun 2,000 years earlier. Thank you, Mikhail. All the way from Russia, the Isotta Fraschini 8A SS. Thank you. Now this you have to see. The 1929 Rolls-Royce Phantom Broom de Ville by Brewster and Company, entered by Frédéric Leroux of France. And yes, it really was ordered like that. Wonderful. Thank you very much. That's perfect. Lovely. I can't actually tell whether it's switched on or off. Is it? It is on, but it stays on. You want it to stay on? Okay, that's fine. I'll assume there's a good reason for that. If Cruella de Vil had existed in real life, surely this is the car that she would have driven. And I have to say, the first owner of this car was a lady who sounds every bit as formidable as Cruella de Vil. Her surnames became longer as she accumulated husbands and fortunes. The lady in question was known as Irene Mamlok Simon Sholkov Karman. I think that was after the third husband. Number two and her had become separated. However, there was fortunately a reconciliation. He was one of the wealthiest men in Buffalo, New Jersey. They became reconciled, I should say, and he sadly died 4 days later. But one assumed that that reconciliation helped her to pay for the new Rolls-Royce that she received just a few months later. And in case you're wondering, let me tell you first of all that back at the time in 1929, the average salary in America was approximately $200 a year. This car cost $19,000, and that was before Brewster, the coach builder, spent 3 months applying the cane work to the rear compartment, which was very fashionable at the time. The gold trim, by the way, was not included in those $19,000. She was a very, very colorful lady. She started a relationship with her dance instructor after the demise of husband number two. Allegedly, she had been at a New Year's Eve party at his house and had $500,000 of jewelry stolen. Oddly enough, after the husband died, the jewelry was found and the dance instructor became husband number three. That didn't last very long because she concluded that the dance instructor was handsome but not very rich. This extraordinary Rolls-Royce went through a number of other hands before it was purchased by the current French collector, and it's its first showing in Europe since its return from the United States. Congratulations. If cars could talk, that car would be, well, probably X-rated. Dominic, Ralph?
Simon, we have the second winner of the special prize by the jury.
And which prize has it won?
Of course, for the most elegant,
Rolls-Royce.
I think that will be the...
Torsten Müller-Oetvos, I'm assuming. Torsten, yes. Are you? Good to see you. You're awarding the prize?
Yeah, of course. It's, as you say, the most beautiful one.
It's the most spectacular one. This lady clearly was not, she was not shy and retiring. The coachwork style, by the way, it's called a broom de ville because it resembles a horse-drawn carriage. You can see how the driver, who obviously was not the person who paid for the car back in the olden days, is in the open with absolutely no form of weather protection. He has windscreen wipers and that's about it. Whereas in the back we have wonderful West of England cloth, beautiful inlays in the wood, gold cappings, all sorts of luxuries, and I think there was a Dunhill Smokers accessory set in the back as well, wasn't there? Which I believe is still there. And look at this, another great anachronism, something that harks back to the days of horse-drawn carriages. These are what we call carriage lights, or opera lights, if you like, on the front of the rear compartment. Wonderfully extravagant, wonderfully impractical, in fact, just wonderful, full stop.
Simon, it could be the dream of Goldfinger. We are talking about Hollywood.
If Goldfinger had been female and 30 years earlier, that undoubtedly is the car that she would have driven.
Of course.
No pressure.
It's really silent.
These Rolls-Royces really are very, very quiet, aren't they? Should we give you just a little gentle push for the last little few meters? Yes, we are. Can we have the service team here for just a gentle little push off the mosaic, please? Or the jury, somebody is saying. Who said? Did your wife say that you were lazy? I'm gonna have to have a talk with her. She hasn't seen you in action pushing a Rolls-Royce Phantom 1, obviously. Not for years. It doesn't fail to start, it's just failed to proceed, as they say. Rolls-Royce made all the car, but the one thing they did not make, sadly, was the battery. It would have been easier if he'd entered an Abarth. And now in the American corner, the 1930 Cadillac V16 of Frederick Lax from the USA. Kai, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Cadillac, the flagship of the General Motors conglomerate. And this was the flagship of the Cadillac range. That's great, perfect. Good to see the brakes work, or maybe not. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Good to see you. All the way from the USA. Whereabouts? California, of course. The Cadillac V16. Well, if you thought that the Bugatti Veyron was innovative in offering you 16 cylinders, the Americans were doing it 70 years before, and Cadillac in particular popularized the V16 engine. Unlike today, where we all want our cars to sound loud and sporty, back in the day, silence was one of the biggest selling points in luxury cars. Cadillac, believe it or not, made over 3,000 of these cars. That's how successful they were. And yet they lost money on every one. But throughout the 1930s, Cadillac offered a V16, in fact, just about the only company to do so, at the absolute top of their range. And if you look at this car, it epitomizes American car design of the time, all the way from the white wall tires, what they call the rumble seat in America. We call it a dicky seat in England. In Italy, they call it the mother-in-law's seat. This is what we Brits would call the trunk, the boot rather. The Americans, and this you can see where the name came from. The Americans call it the trunk. And the whole look of the car, if you have a chance afterwards, look at the inside. Everything is beautifully made, but made very much with the emphasis on comfort and luxury. And again, look at the magnificent Cadillac mascot. You're never short of lights and horns and basically appendages to ensure that the person in front knows that he needs to move over for you. Ralph, Dominic.
Simon is the third winner of the special prize by the jury.
And Ralph Huber is awarding the special prize. What is it, Franco?
For the most sensitive restoration. So the jury was amazed about the restoration of this car.
Fred, you've won the... Fred, you have won also a special prize for the most sensitive restoration, which Ulrich Knieps, the head of BMW Classic, is going to award to you.
Ulrich is the head of BMW Classic.
These lights, by the way, on the sides of what we call the windscreen, the Americans insist on calling the windshield, have a very practical purpose. Apart from looking good, they also have a swivel arm from inside the car, which means that if you're going down a street looking for a particular number and you can't see it on the houses, you can turn that and have a look at the house numbers on your right or left-hand side. Thank you very much. If you're on this side of the car, by the way, you'll also see that little side door. That is the golf club door, which tells you the kind of person that bought these cars when they were new. Now, right up behind, and just 2 years younger, the Packard Standard 8 of Mark van Leeuwen from the Netherlands. Now, the advertising slogan of Packard, which was one of the great American luxury brands from its inception until its demise in 1958, was one of the great advertising slogans of all time. Ask the man who owns one, they said. And here it is, the Sport Phaeton, which was this distinctive body style. Once again, you'll see that in America, they loved the idea of having this rear deck between the front and rear passengers and a separate screen, the Oster screen, or the dual cowl Phaeton, as the Americans call it. After all, I think it's fair to say they popularized it, so we'll use their term. Now, on the basis that the slogan said, ask the man who owns one, and also on the basis that you've just driven from Paris to Amsterdam, what is it like to own a Packard?
It's marvelous. It's best quality ever built. It's really good, and it's a sophisticated car. The engine is really running smooth, and you know, it's just really good.
How many kilometers did you do on the Paris to Amsterdam rally?
Well, actually, the Spain rally last year was 2,200 kilometers, which was much more. 14% hills and 30 degrees, and you know, it was good. And
you're obviously a Packard fan.
I am, sir. I am. Yeah. When I saw the car for the first time, I just fell in love.
Did you have a particular ambition to own a Packard before then, or not?
No, not really. I just saw the car and fell in love.
Well, there you go. You've heard it from the man who owns one, and hard to imagine greater praise, but you've been using it. You get your participant certificate and medal from Ralph and Dominic for the Packard Standard 8 Sport Phaeton of 1932. Mark, thank you once again, and congratulations. Great to see these cars still being used in the way that they were intended. And now, still staying in this very opulent Gatsby-esque period, the period of Art Deco, the period of the Chrysler Building, the period of the Great Gatsby and Wall Street and Hollywood, and 1 year younger, but also an American car, despite the Rolls-Royce grille. It's Sam Lehrman from the US of A in the 1933 Rolls-Royce Phantom 2 Sports Saloon by Brewster. Perfect, perfect. That's great, Sam. Thank you very much. Now, it's a Rolls-Royce, but not a Rolls-Royce as we know it. In the 1920s, the American government introduced huge import taxes to try and favor American car producers. And Rolls-Royce, thinking on their feet, decided that the way around this was to start a separate Rolls-Royce factory in the USA. And that is exactly what they did in a place called Springfield in Massachusetts. And they started building complete cars that did not therefore need to be imported from the UK. And you can usually tell American Rolls-Royces of this period because they're the only ones that have left-hand drive. The coach builder was a company called Brewster in New York, and Brewster, rather like the Phantom that we saw earlier, the Cruella de Vil car, if I can call it that, had very advanced, very rakish coachwork compared to the often more conservative British and European designs. And look, for example, at the sweep of that V windshield, rather like the Riva speedboats that you've been admiring on the lake today. Despite the fact that this looks like a convertible car, this top is actually fixed, and we have this much more aerodynamic rear, culminating in what they call the fishtail exhaust at the back. Everything on this car speaks of power and speed. Even the door handles, which would give a safety legislator gray hair today, they look like miniature daggers on each door. You wouldn't want to be impaled on one of those if you were a pedestrian. But a great-looking car, a car that, if I remember correctly, was given by the first owner as a gift to his daughter. She lived in Florida. The first owner was a banker who owned 7 Rolls-Royces, no fewer. I've yet to meet a poor banker. But I have to say he had excellent taste in motor cars. Sam, thank you very much. The Rolls-Royce Phantom 2. And before you go, just collect your medal and certificate from Ralph Huber and Dominic Fishlin. Brewster, incidentally, liked to give English names to their coachwork styles. I think that in the grand homes of America in the 1930s, they liked to choose in the Brewster catalog between designs such as a Piccadilly, Henley, a York, or an Ascot Roadster. Richard Gorman in the passenger seat, a well-known Rolls-Royce restorer in America. Sam Lehrman driving the Phantom 2. And now rounding out this class, all the way from Europe, the Mercedes-Benz 540K Cabriolet A, driven by Ian Tiriac from Romania. Well, in fact, Ian is in the passenger seat, and if the name sounds familiar, it's because Ian is one of the pioneers of sports management. He was, I believe, Boris Becker's manager for a number of years. That's lovely. Thank you very much. If you'd like to stop it, that's perfect. Sporting success does indeed have its perks, and one of them is this Mercedes-Benz 540K Cabriolet A. And before you, I believe, another sporting impresario, Mr. Bernie Eccleston, was the previous owner of this car. Everything about this car speaks of, can I say, power and arrogance. From the V radiator, the 3-pointed star if you're on this side, the exhaust pipes that come out the side of the car, the Banshee wail of the supercharger if you hear the car at speed, all the way back to this high-standing soft top and the cropped tail. And if you were able to look in the car as it passes, you'll see there's even a sideways-facing passenger seat for occasional conveyance. but this was, in the late 1930s, the flagship of the Mercedes-Benz range. They were cars that they weren't available for test drives because they were built only to order. They had the particularity, the peculiarity of this Banshee wail from the supercharger. And the supercharger, it's like a turbocharger today, and it forced petrol at great speed or at great pressure into the engine. It wasn't engaged all the time, otherwise you blow up the engine. You push the accelerator most of the way down, and then the last little bit, the last few centimeters, you could feel another accelerator underneath engaging the supercharger that had this very distinctive wail that would hopefully scare the person off the road in front of you. Ralph, Dominic, thank you. Ian Turiak with the Mercedes-Benz 540K Cabriolet A, all the way from Romania. It certainly is an international Concours d'Elegance. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Good to see you, as always. Thank you. Have a look also at the mother of pearl dashboard if you get a chance as the car goes by. A particular favorite of some of the more active German politicians in the late 1930s. Class C, shaped by the winds, the Grand Routier of the Art Deco era. Still a similar period, but here, as you'll see, the cars become lower, more svelte, and altogether younger, rather like the owners. Anthony and Anna McLean. Anthony, the nephew of Fitzroy McLean, the founder of the SAS, for those Brits amongst us, with this wonderful Lancia Astura Bocca Cabriolet. Do you want to switch it off, Anthony? I know you're a great believer in Lancias, so I don't doubt for a moment that it will start again without any difficulty whatsoever, or there are lots of us here to push. The Lancia Astura was in Italy what the Mercedes-Benz you've just seen was in Germany in the late 1930s. The last word in luxury, but this car, unlike the Mercedes, has sporting pretensions as well. The name Astura comes from a small island off the Italian coast. Up until then, Lancias had all been given Greek names. Lambda, for example, is one of the more famous. But with this, they broke with tradition, and it's known as the Astura. The bodywork on this car was by Farina, which later became Pininfarina. And one of the innovations of this car is that it has, already in the 1930s, an electric hood, electric soft top. It's said that Pininfarina himself was driving one of these cars one day when he got caught in a thunderstorm, and he got so soaked that he resolved to find an easier way to put the hood up. But as you can see, despite the car's size, it has a lightness of line, and Anthony, who's a great lancista, confirms that you can drive it with just 2 fingers. Bocca is the name of the coachwork style, because the Lancia dealer from Biella was called Bocca and ordered, I think, about 10 of these cars in this particular body style. This car, despite being 82 years old, has never been restored. It still has the original interior, much of the original paint, all the chrome work, and it really is, from these bullet-shaped lights to the polished aluminium decor to this beautiful V-tail, an absolute masterpiece of Art Deco design seen from a late 1930s Italian perspective. Now, you know the routine by now. Ralph and Dominic are going to come and give you your participants' medals.
Simon, you mentioned that the conservation of this car is very good, so that this car is winning the 4th special prize by the jury for the best preserved pre-war car of the event.
So, Anthony, Mario Thiessen
this is
of
the FIFA prize.
the deputy chairman of
FIFA prize.
You have won the FIFA award for the best preserved pre-war car. And I have to say, at Villa d'Este, we try to promote cars that have never been restored and cars that are driven in the way that they were intended. And this car certainly qualifies on both counts. Anthony, Anna, great to have you with us at Villa d'Este, I think for the first time. And I hope it won't be the last. Thank you. Look at those wonderful hubcaps as well. Absolute pinnacle of Art Deco design. Car number 30 did not make it as Lord Bamford's daughter, he's the entrant, has just had a baby. So he has a valid excuse for not being here, which means that we move straight on to car number 36. Sorry, 34, the Bugatti Type 57 Atalante. Now this was really the last successful, thank you, that's great, just stop right there. Don't go, we want to have a quick word about you and your car. Albert Vetz of Luxembourg. Albert, if you'd like to switch off the engine, good to see you, good afternoon. Do you want to switch off the engine? You can turn off the engine. Yeah. You can turn it off. Sorry, I needed to say it in French. The Bugatti Type 57. The Bugatti Type 57 was the last successful Bugatti road car. As we saw earlier on, by the mid-1930s, Bugatti was being beaten on the tracks by the might of the German teams, Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union, and even on the showroom floor, Bugatti's cars were losing ground to rivals. Jean Bugatti, Ettore's very talented son, Gianroberto was actually his birth name, had taken over the running of the company in the early 1930s, and this is one of the cars that he came up with. It's a straight 8, 3.3 litres, and it's a car that you could either buy with Bugatti coachwork, or you could have it clothed by an outside coach builder of your choice. The coachwork styles tended to be offered with the names of mountain passes such as Aravis or Galibier or Stelvio, but in this case, for what is considered to be a masterpiece of Art Deco design, Jean decided to call it the Atalante. Now, Atalante, named after Atlanta, the Greek goddess of speed. It was said that any man, she would marry any man who could catch her in a race. These were cars capable in the day of some 180 to 200 kilometers an hour, so they lived up to the promise of their name. And this particular car was first owned by a man called Marcel Doré, who was a French aviator and record breaker. And in the very same year that he received his new Bugatti, he attempted the Paris to Tokyo air record. He got as far as Hanoi, and after covering 11,000 kilometers in 71 hours, he had to retire just 4,000 kilometers from the finish line. But for his transport on the land, this is the car that he used. Ralph, Dominic? After the war, sadly, Jean Bugatti died whilst testing the racing version of this car just before the Le Mans race in 1939. He was testing it on the road, and he asked two of his employees to close the road. He was just near the Bugatti factory in Molsheim, and they thought they had closed the road, but unfortunately a drunken cyclist appeared from a side road, and Jean Bugatti, avoiding him, crashed and was killed. Ettore Bugatti never really recovered from the sorrow of losing his son, and he himself died in 1947, and the Bugatti brand really died with him, although they continued servicing cars for a few years later. But if you talk about Bugatti road cars, this really is the golden period of those wonderful cars from Molsheim in the Alsace. Thank you, merci. Albert Vetz avec la Bugatti Type 57 Atalante, depuis le Luxembourg. Now, if you think Marcel Doré, the first owner of that car, was an interesting character, let me tell you about the first owner of the next car, which is a Bentley 4.25 litre, bodied by Erdmann and Rossi, a Berlin coach builder, very unusual for an English car, especially in the late 1930s. And the car is entered by Saulius Karosas, all the way from Lithuania. Good afternoon, Saulius. And he always has a glamorous entourage. Lovely to see you, as always, Saulius. Great to see you all. Good afternoon. You can stop the engine, because I'd like to say a few words about your car. Now, we could talk about Bentley, and we could talk about Erdmann and Rossi, the coach builder that bodied this car. But instead, I'd like to talk a little bit about the first owner of this car. His name was Baron Harold von Oppenheim. And if that surname sounds familiar, it's because the Van Oppenheims for centuries have been one of the best-known banking families in Germany. He was 45 years old when he ordered his new Bentley. He ordered it in the family colors of blue with a red interior, and he set about driving the car vigorously, let's put it that way. He drove it so vigorously that, in fact, the rear brakes caught on fire on his first trip. He had to remove these wonderful covers over the rear wheels, which were a stylistic feature of Erdmann and Rossi, the Berlin coach builders who clothed this car. He then decided to drive to Monte Carlo, and as he was driving from Germany to Monte Carlo, the Second World War broke out. So he turned around, and instead of Monte Carlo, he drove up to Le Havre, and he put himself and the car on the last ship bound for New York. There he took a new name. He called himself Harry Hartwell. He lived above the Ritz. He opened Harry's nightclub, and he also opened a laundrette, as all good barons should, before returning to Germany in 1951. His Bentley, on the other hand, stayed in America, and it was largely lost until the previous owner of the car found it in a classified advert advertised by a wholesale baker in New York in the 1980s. Saulius has had the car completely restored to its original appearance, and it's great to see it being enjoyed in a way which undoubtedly Harry von Oppenheim would have approved of. Thank you very much. Your prizes for entering from Ralph and from Dominic: the Bentley 4¼ litre Cabriolet by Erdmann and Rossi, entered by Saulius Karosas from Lithuania. I have to say, every year we seem to be getting a more and more international entry in this Concours d'Elegance, and it's great to see that. Thank you. It must have been quite a laundrette. Now, we're still in the 1930s, and we're still in Europe. Now, if you didn't want your Bugatti to have a coupe body, this was an alternative. Entered by Audrey and Martin Groos, the Bugatti Type 57 Cabriolet by Dieter and Frère of Belgium. A little bit further, Martin, just... That is absolutely perfect. Wonderful. Thank you very much. That's absolutely great. As we said earlier, in the 1930s, and you can switch it off, Martin. In the 1930s, you would still order your car, generally speaking, just as a bare chassis and an engine. The bodywork was something that you could choose, and anything was possible. The only limiting factors were your imagination and your wallet. Now, the first owner of this car was a Belgian gentleman, Monsieur Bagage, if I remember correctly. And he ordered the car on the 9th of March, 1938, marked urgent, and he received it no more than 2 weeks later. He took it to Dieter and Frère, who still exists today. Roland Dieter is here with us. He's the latest generation of that great Belgian automotive dynasty. They're motor car importers, but they were also at the time coach builders, and they created for Monsieur Bagage this wonderful sweeping 2- to 3-seater roadster. You can see that the driver and passenger sit in the front, with behind them, sideways, this, what you might call the 2+1 seating configuration. And just look at the sweep of the tail, and in particular, these pontoon rear wings and this vestigial fin, which was intended to convey a semblance of aerodynamics. Cars of this period were often sculptural. Don't forget, we're in the Art Deco era. Bugattis in particular look every bit as good in the 1930s under the skin as they do on top. And if you get a chance, perhaps later today or tomorrow, to have a look under the bonnet of this car, do so, because it's often said that the engine of the Type 57 Bugatti is the best looking engine in history. It's a blokey thing, but take my word for it. Thank you very much, Martin. Giving you the awards are Ralph and Dominic Fischlin. The Participants Awards. You've come a long way from New York. You've come a long way from New York and Palm Beach. And it's great to have you here with us again after a few years. Good to see you as always. The Bugatti Type 57 Roadster by Dieter. And now we fast forward just a few short years, but they are the years of the Second World War. And during that time, car design, like the design of so many other things, aircraft and so forth, progressed dramatically. Here we're in the late 1940s, 1949 to be exact, and the Bentley Mark VI Coupe of Fred Kritz, all the way from Monaco. Lovely to see you both, and great to see you, to have you back with us at the Villa d'Este Concours. You're amongst the most loyal participants, and we appreciate it. The Bentley Mark VI was the first Bentley where Bentley would sell you the entire car, not just a chassis and engine. In fact, the very first cars were tested at the end of the war by British Army officers to ensure that they were put through the most grueling conditions. Such was the shortage of steel in post-war Britain, or indeed most of post-war Europe, that production of these cars was necessarily very limited. In fact, in 1952, a 3-year-old Bentley Mark VI cost more than a brand new car simply because there was such a waiting list to receive them. The idea with this car was to make a high-performance version of what was normally considered to be a luxury car. So two Bentley engineers took the Bentley Mark VI, which was normally a saloon. They created a lightweight body. They gave it just 2 doors. And they created a car that the prototype was known as the Corniche. And when it came out, it was the most expensive and fastest car of its type in the entire world. This particular car has been beautifully restored. Fred and Donna are great Rolls-Royce and Bentley and Mercedes aficionados. And they have shown a number of exquisite cars here at Villa d'Este. As I said before, great to have you here, and a car that we have never had here before at Villa d'Este, the Bentley Mark VI Coupe. Dominic and Ralph, with your entrance prizes.
Simon, there is another prize giving for this car.
And you're winning a special award as well,
yes,
Franco?
From the jury, a special award, this Trofeo Julius Baer for the car which showcases exceptional craftsmanship from its time. So
a car that showcases exceptional craftsmanship for its time, no less. So you're receiving the award for that.
The prize comes from Marco Parroni, Deputy Head Marketing of the Julius Baer, of course.
So Marco from Julius Baer handing over this trophy for the greatest craftsmanship of its time to Fred and Donna Kritz with the Bentley Mark VI. And incidentally, a small detail of this car, just before they drive away, notice how the radiator is slightly slanted compared to the standard Bentley radiator. Believe it or not, the traditionalists at the time described it as shocking. Fred, Donna, great to see you. Thank you very much. See you later on. Same period, 2 years younger to be exact, and we crossed the channel, and the first of our Ferraris today, it's the Ferrari 212 Export Cabriolet by Vignale, entered and driven by Peter Calico from New York City. The Empire State, 1951, with Nicholas Calico, Peter's son, a Hollywood filmmaker, of course, in the passenger seat. Peter, good to have you with us again. What can we say about Ferrari? This is a car from the days when almost nobody knew what Ferrari was. Most people had never heard of Ferrari in the early 1950s. He was a little-known race team owner from the Modena area who built just a very small number of road cars really to fund his racing car habit, if we can put it that way. Everything was made by hand. Everything was ordered exactly the way that the client wanted it. The emphasis, as always with Ferraris, though, was very much on the engine. In fact, Enzo Ferrari famously said to a client who complained about the coachwork of his car, "Don't complain, I'm selling you the engine, everything else I'm giving you for free." Now, this particular car was sold to the Portuguese ambassador to France by Luigi Chinetti, who became the American importer for Ferrari, and he sold this car to the ambassador, who intended to give it to his brother to race. Sadly, though, the brother died in a road accident before he could race the car, so Luigi Chinetti, in his great grief, offered to buy it back from him for half the price that he just paid for it. Now, it's a car that has so many little details that I'm going to allow you or suggest to you that rather than me telling you about them now, you should take a look afterwards when you see the car displayed. But for example, the Ferrari badge, the chrome moldings, everything on this car is beautifully detailed. These mock rear air intakes on the wings that mimic the air intake on the bonnet. The fact that it was still right-hand drive, as Ferraris were in the early 1950s. They weren't left-hand drive. Luxury cars were right-hand drive. Humble cars were left-hand drive in Italy at the time. Peter chased this car for years and years and years. And he said to me this morning that to get it, he did something that no calico should ever do. You paid the asking price. Ralph, Dominic. Peter, what's on the script? I'm just being asked by Ian. What's on the script on the side?
It says Vignale SF.
Does it not say Ferrari beneath that?
I don't think so.
Well, we're going to tell you something new about your car. It does say Ferrari. You see, you learn something new at Villa d'Este all the time. They wrote it in Italian handwriting, which is like a doctor. You can't read it. Peter, Nicholas, good to see you both. Thank you very much. The Ferrari 212 Vignale Spider. Same country, same period, different manufacturer. The Fiat 8V Berlinetta Vignale owned by Manfred Schwery from Switzerland. A little bit further up. Wonderful, that's great. Thank you very much, perfect. Fiat, now we associate Fiat these days with much more humble cars than this exotic GT, but in the early 1950s, Fiat were determined to get into the GT market. Two-door sports cars that you could race or drive on the road. And the car that they created to achieve that aim was called the 8V. 8V because Ford had already trademarked the V8 name, but that's the layout of the engine, which is something very unusual in Italy, particularly Fiat, which is associated with small, simple four-cylinder engines. They'd already put two designers in a cold, unheated office at Fiat's Turin plant before the end of the war to start studying the 8V concept. It came out at the beginning of the 1950s. Most of them, and we will see one later, had standard Fiat coachwork, but a very small number were sold to outside coach builders who could really indulge their creative talents on the Fiat 8V chassis. The standard cars were often raced. These were very much more show cars, and you can tell from the prominent grille at the front and the abundance of chrome moldings, for example, along the side of the car, this porthole air intake, the chrome molding breaking up the side of the car, and look at these great torpedo tube rear lights. This is more fashion statement than racer. And the man responsible for styling this car was a young man at the time, Giovanni Michelotti. He had started as a floor sweeper, aged 16, in the coachworks of Stabilimenti Farina, and he was very, very enthusiastic, absolutely wanted a job in the car styling industry. And he was spotted by Attilio Farina, the boss's son, who said, I think this guy's got something going for him. They gave him a job, and he became one of the most prolific and successful designers in 1950s and 60s Italian automotive circles. Manfred, you're going to receive your prize from Ralph and Dominic, giving you the entrance prize and certificate for the Vignale Fiat 8V Berlinetta designed by Giovanni Michelotti. Despite the fact that it is very much a car in an elegant suit, this car still managed to take part in the 1954 and 1955 Mille Miglias. And once again, as I've said before, if you get a chance to look inside this car as Manfred drives it past, look at the dashboard. It looks like something out of a 1950s jukebox. And American car styling in the 50s was considered to be the coolest of all. Bear in mind that here in Europe, there had been a lot of American influence culturally, rock and roll music, the soldiers coming over, Marlboro cigarettes, everybody wanted a pair of Levi's jeans, and we all tried to copy the Americans in 1950s car design. Thank you very much. I can see you're getting hot in there. They hadn't invented air conditioning in Italy yet in 1953. Manfred Schwery with the Fiat 8V. Now here is something which you will never see anywhere else because there's only one of them in the world. Peter Newmark with the Jaguar XK120 SE Coupe by Pininfarina. Good afternoon, Peter. Look at that. A little bit further. Perfect. That's it. Spot on. We'll never know quite why this car was built. Was it an order from a customer? Was it built as a show car to show what might be possible? History doesn't record it. What we do know, though, is that Max Hoffmann, who was one of the great entrepreneurs of the automotive world in the 1950s and 60s, asked Jaguar if they would consider modernizing the line of their XK120 sports car, and he got fairly short shrift from the founder of Jaguar, William Lyons. So, undeterred, Max Hoffmann took a standard Jaguar XK120, which is a much more, can I say, old-fashioned design, almost a pre-war design, usually a roadster, and he bought a completed car like anybody else, and he gave it to Pininfarina in Turin and asked them to create this one-off coupe. As you can see, if you know what a standard XK120 looks like, this is a much more modern car in its overall appearance, and perhaps unsurprisingly much more Latin, much more Alfa or Ferrari-esque in its appearance. It's a car that after its motor show debut, I think it was the Geneva Show 55, Peter, where this car was shown. After that, it made its way to America, and it disappeared in the mists of time until it turned up in the late 1970s in Germany as a wreck. It sat for another 20 years untouched until Peter, who is a great Jaguar fancier, has a C-Type and a D-Type and various other wonderful things. Peter bought the car and had it restored by his restoration company, CMC. I have to say, it rather helps to own your own restoration company if you're going to undertake projects like this. It does help.
Still expensive.
Still expensive. I'm not a customer. You don't need to tell me that yet. Peter, your prize from Ralph and Dominic for the Jaguar XK120 Pininfarina Coupe, if you like, the love child of an Italian and an Anglo-Italian love affair started by the great Max Hoffmann, who incidentally was also responsible for so many other cars of the time, BMW 507, Mercedes 300 SL, countless Ferraris and so forth. Thank you very much. Now here's another, what we might call hybrid. This time it's an Anglo-American hybrid, also known as described by Car Life in 1961 as the Corvette Italiano. Here it is with Abraham Joseph from the USA, from Chicago to be precise, one of 3 Chevrolet Corvettes to be bodied by Scaglietti of Modena. Now that's what I call a long bonnet. Thank you very much, that's great. Well, you've all heard of the Shelby Cobra, I'm sure, but this, in fact, was Carroll Shelby's first car. Carroll Shelby was a chicken farmer originally who turned his hand to race car driving and also became a car dealer. He decided in the late 1950s that the racing rules in the SCCA, in the American Sports Car Club of America, would allow a producer, would allow a team to build a Corvette but to make it lighter by having the bodywork made by somebody else rather than using the standard factory body. And so he commissioned 3 of these cars. He did it with his business partner Jim Hall and a Corvette dealer called Gary Laughlin. And they bought 3 new Corvettes. They managed to persuade General Motors to sell them 3 cars without a body. They sent them to Italy, and the cars were bodied here in the Modena area by Sergio Scaglietti, the famous coach builder who is better known for bodying Ferraris. And it's perhaps no coincidence that this car looks very much like the 1959 Ferrari Tour de France. Now, no sooner had one of those cars been finished, this car in particular, than one of the three partners received a call from one of the top managers at Chevrolet and said, look, it wouldn't be too cool for this car to beat our cars in racing. And what's more, the rules had just changed, so a larger quantity of cars needed to be built. And so they took the hint and they stopped the project there and then. Although it didn't stop Carroll Shelby a few years later from approaching this time Ford. I think by then he was wary of General Motors collaborations and sourcing from Ford the V8 engine with which he built the immortal Shelby Cobra. I believe we have, again, the plaque and the certificates medal from Dominic and Ralph for Abraham Joseph from Chicago in the Chevrolet Corvette Italiano. Just one of these cars finished in the period, and believe it or not, it's 180 kilos lighter than the standard Corvette. Thanks very much. Great to see this car here. None of us have ever seen it before. Looks great. Sounds great. Thank you.
Very nice.
All the way from Chicago, USA, David McNeil in the Ferrari 250 short wheelbase. David, do you want to? I like the way you've matched the outfits to the car. Very chic. Congratulations. Switch it off if you wouldn't mind, because I have a few. There's a lot to say about this car. The Ferrari 250 short wheelbase. This has to be one of the absolute high points of sports car design. Short wheelbase because the car that came before was a little bit longer, but it was a little bit unwieldy in terms of its handling, and so Ferrari shortened the wheelbase. They shortened the chassis of the car by 20 centimeters, and that transformed the handling. And ever since, the nickname of this model has been the Ferrari 250 short wheelbase. For the bodywork, Ferrari turned to Pininfarina to design it. Lorenzo's forebears did the styling of the outside of the car. Scaglietti would actually turn it into a metal reality, beating the body into shape on a tree stump in the Modena area. And this particular short wheelbase is one of the very few cars that was made for the road, but with competition features for the first owner, who was clearly a lover of speed. And if you can believe it, this car spent no fewer than 40 years in one of the most unlikely places in Hawaii. It survived volcanoes and I'm sure much else. I have to say it's much better than Tom Selleck's choice of Ferrari in Magnum PI. But the 250 short wheelbase is an absolute icon in Ferrari history. David McNeil is, can I call you an enthusiastic Ferrari collector? He has one of the best Ferrari collections in the world. Helped by the fact that he makes WeatherTech floor mats. And if you're wondering how floor mats pay for cars like this, that's because he sells 30,000 sets a day. Good man. Thanks, David. Now, that was an absolute classic of early 1960s sports car design. Look at that. Look at that backside as it goes by. A client once said to me, it's got the best backside since Claudia Schiffer. And yet, look at this car, which makes an exotic Albert and Rita Spiess with a car that makes a 1960s Ferrari seem positively commonplace. The Alfa Romeo Tipo 33 Stradale. Rita, I don't know, do you need to open the door? Because I know how hot it gets in there. Question is, do both doors open at the same time? And I think I can guess the answer to that. Okay, well, in that case, we'll leave it there. In the late 1960s, Alfa Romeo created a car called the Tipo 33. It was a Le Mans car, it was a race car, it raced all over Europe and the USA. I would describe it as moderately successful. It didn't always finish, but when it did, it showed good pace. But undeterred by that, or perhaps because of that, Alfa Romeo thought they had the clever idea of making a road-going version. The design of the bodywork was entrusted to a little-known designer these days, but he really is one of the unsung heroes of Italian car design. His name was Franco Scaglione. He came from Florence, the capital of the Renaissance, and he penned what I think is one of the most beautiful cars ever built. A few years ago, when we had one of these cars at Villa d'Este, one of the jury members came up with a description which I think sums it up perfectly. He coined the word brutiful, and I don't think there's ever been a better looking car. They only built a handful of these in the end, perhaps unsurprisingly, considering that it cost 9.7 million lira new when you could buy a Lamborghini Miura for 7 million lira. Practicality, as we can see from the doors, was perhaps not the top of Mr. Scaglione's priority list. It has an 8-cylinder 2-liter engine. It's about as many cylinders as you can squeeze into just 2 liters. It has fuel injection. It has a 6-speed gearbox. It has all this plexiglass surface. It's rather like driving a very fast greenhouse. But fast it was. One of the first people to buy one of these cars, one of the first owners, was an American gentleman called Henry Wessels III. He collected his car from the Alfa Romeo factory just outside of Milan, and he drove it straight to Venice. And on the road to Venice, he got out his stopwatch and he timed himself with the motorway markers. And at 10,000 revs, I mean, you can imagine the noise this thing must have been doing at 10,000 revs, he clocked himself at 270 kilometers an hour. You would not want to buy a car run in when it was new by Mr. Wessels, clearly. But I have to say he had exquisite taste in cars, and this is one of the high points of not only today, but I think any car event. Albert,
Simon, sorry.
There is an additional prize for you.
Yes, there is an additional prize. It's a Trofeo Asi for the best preserved post-war car by the jury. It's presented by Alberto Scuro, Vice President of the Asi.
Quindi la macchina meglio conservata
post-war
del dopoguerra.
Exactly.
E premia?
Alberto Scuro, vicepresidente dell'ASI.
Mr. Alberto Scuro, the vice president of ASI, which is the Italian Classic Car Association. I think I've said enough. I will let you go, Albert. The Alfa Romeo Tipo 33 Stradale, one of approximately 10 in the world, but frankly, nobody knows how many exist. Ciao. The door is not open for effect. It's open because it's about 35 degrees in there. And now we move on to Class E. Speed meets style, the flowering of the sports and the racing car. And what more appropriate to start this class than the Jaguar C-Type of Dr. Hans-Martin Schneeberger from Switzerland. Perfect. Just impeccable. Thank you very much. If you can, that's great. The Jaguar C-Type. Now, Sir William Lyons was the founder of Jaguar. He started out in the late 1920s making sidecars for motorcycles. Obviously a man, though, of some ambition. He graduated to cars in the 1930s. He made his car name was called SS, for Swallow Sidecar. After the war, those initials weren't very popular, so it became Jaguar. And then for the early 1950s, he decided to create a bespoke racing car with which to beat Ferrari. And this was that car. The Jaguar C-Type, C stands for competition, was a car that anybody could buy if they could afford it. Relatively affordable compared to some of the more expensive offerings from Ferrari, for example. But it was a car that was hugely successful, and it really put Jaguar on the map as a competition car. They won Le Mans, 2 times in the 1950s? And then, of course, it was followed by the D-Type. By then, they hadn't figured out what the D actually stood for. They just knew that it came after C. Of course, the S-Type, F-Type, and all the rest comes afterwards. But it uses the same mechanics as a Jaguar Saloon of the time, and in a clearly much more competition-orientated package with this 2-seater sports racing bodywork. This car, as you can tell from or as you might be able to guess from the color, was sold new to the States. White was always the national color of American racing cars. And the first owner of this car was one Marston Gregory. Many of you will have heard of that name. He was a bespectacled, cigar-smoking man from Kansas. He was known as the Kansas City Flash, I believe, and he was the heir to an insurance fortune, which always helps when you want to be a gentleman driver. Thank you. Hans-Martin Schneeberger with the Jaguar C-Type XKC 015. Marston Gregory's first race car. Now, we've talked a lot about the owners of some of these cars when they were new, but I don't think any owner was more charismatic than the first owner of this particular car. It's the Ferrari 750 Monza, entered by Jose Fernandez from Spain. Jose Maria, good afternoon. Lovely to see you both. Now, I have to tell you the name of the first owner of this car because it's so good you couldn't have invented it. Alfonso Antonio Vicente Eduardo Angel Blas Francisco de Boria Cabeza de Vaca y Leighton. That's pretty cool, right? Viva la España. No fewer than 14 surnames. If I tell you that in addition to that, he was a millionaire, he spoke 4 languages fluently, he was, of course, an aristocrat, he was a marquis, he raced in the Grand National Steeplechase twice, although it was a problem because he weighed 77 kilos, and he decided to go, when he decided to go bobsled racing, he found 3 of his aristocratic buddies. They did a grand total of 2 test runs in practice and then managed to come 4th overall in the 1956 Olympic Games. He was a dude. It was said that of his race cars, they always came back with tons of dents in the nose because his preferred technique was to try and nudge the competitors out of the way at 200 kilometers an hour. Unfortunately, Alfonso de Portago, as he was known to friends, came to an end with his later Ferrari on the 1957 Mille Miglia when he crashed with fatal results. He had just jumped over the barriers at the previous stop to kiss his girlfriend, Linda Christian, the actress, hello, and to say, I'll see you in Brescia, which, of course, he never saw. This was the car that he had before that, with the flames on the nose, clearly intended to intimidate his opponents. But this was Alfonso de Portago's first Ferrari racing car, and it's called the Monza because it's a model that debuted at Monza in 1953. It wasn't an easy car to drive. In fact, the great world champion Alberto Ascari was test driving one of these cars at Monza in 1955. On a day off, in fact, his friends, 2 other racing drivers, had called him and said, come to the track, we want to see what you think of this Ferrari. He came over in his normal civilian clothes, took the car out for a spin, and sadly, he never came back at the end of the next lap. And so he perished at the wheel of a 750 Monza. It's not an easy car to drive fast. It's unusual in being a Ferrari with only 4 cylinders, but the logic behind that was that 4-cylinder cars had more low-down power, which suited low-speed, twisty tracks better than the V12s that had more power but less low-down speed that suited faster tracks better. Great to see you both once again at Villa d'Este, and if cars could speak, Alfonso de Portago's car would have, I'm sure, lots of stories to tell. Thank you. The racing driver that all other men love to... The racing driver... It sounds good. The racing driver that all other men love to hate. Now, the first of our Aston Martins here today is driven by Stefan Hoffmann from Germany, and it's the Aston Martin DB3S. Good afternoon, Stefan. Good to see you, Stefan. I like the way that you've matched your hat to the car. Very chic. I can see that you're in the Villa d'Este spirit. Aston Martin. We all know it as James Bond's car, of course, and more on that later, but Aston Martin started out over 100 years ago as a very small producer in England. The name comes from Aston Clinton, which is a small village near Buckingham, where the car won its first ever race. And the Martin bit of the name comes from Lionel Martin, who was the founder of the brand. Aston Martin made small, jewel-like and very expensive sports cars throughout the 1920s and 30s. It had a habit of going bust almost as frequently as it won races. I think in the last 100 years, Aston Martin has gone bust no fewer than 7 times, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm not making that up. The current chairman actually told me that. An industrialist called David Brown, who made his fortune in the Midlands of England, making gears for cars and trucks, saw a small classified advertisement in the Times newspaper in 1947, and it said something like sports car manufacturer for sale. And his curiosity piqued. He inquired more and found out that the company in question was Aston Martin. He bought it. He also bought Lagonda, the other British sports car manufacturer, at the same time. He combined the two into Aston Martin Lagonda, and he set about building what are considered to be some of the prettiest and most successful racing cars of the 1950s and early 60s. The DB3S, which this model is DB, as you can tell, David Brown. He prefixed all the models with his initials. 3, it was the 3rd model that he introduced, and S for sports. And again, you can tell from the color of this car as well that it was sold to the US. Generally speaking, US cars would have white bodywork with usually blue livery, the national racing colors of the States. This was sold new to a Californian gentleman driver, and now it is owned by a Munich gentleman driver. Stefan, always a pleasure. It's good to see the young generation taking over here at Villa d'Este, by the way, and long may it continue. Thank you. That would have been the direct rival of the Jaguar that you just saw. Now, if we go forwards just about 5 years, we are about to see one of the rarest, most powerful, and most exotic Ferrari racing cars ever built. The car is a Ferrari 335 Sport. It's from 1958, and it is entered by Andreas Moringer from Austria. Good afternoon, Andreas. That's it, Paul. Perfect. And we can see the brakes work. Paul Russell, the master restorer, restores cars for some of the greatest collections in the world, including the Ralph Lauren collection. He restored this car carefully, conservatively for Andreas Moringer, an Austrian collector with, I have to say, exquisite taste. Now, I won't bore you. I could talk about this car until tomorrow, which will scare especially my wife. But it really is something very, very special. This was the late and great Phil Hill's favorite racing car. Phil Hill, 1961 world champion in Formula One, America's first world champion, and also one of the men who raced this car. We talked a little bit before about Alfonso de Portago and the Ferrari Monza that we just saw Jose Maria Fernandez driving. This is the same model of car with which Alfonso, I'm sorry to say this, but Alfonso de Portago crashed to his death at approximately 170 miles an hour on the last ever Mille Miglia in 1957. This was a car that combined immense power, lightweight, and handling that only very few drivers were capable of taming in the day. It was the most powerful, the fastest, and the most formidable car that was reserved really just for the top drivers of the Ferrari factory team. After these cars were outlawed in Europe, after the Mille Miglia, the rules changed, the engine size became limited. These cars were no longer eligible to race in Europe. They had a new lease of life in America. And this particular car was the last of only 4 that were built. It was sold new to a chicken farmer, believe it or not, a sort of an American Bernard Matthews in Texas, I believe, was Alan Connell in Texas. Yep. And he actually, to his credit, raced it with great success until in about 1961. He bought the car from the American Ferrari importer, Luigi Chinetti. In about 1961, he blew up the engine and wrote to Ferrari, as you did those days, no email, and said, you know, can you supply me a new engine for my very expensive Ferrari? To which the answer was, you can guess, no. They said, sorry, Mr. Connell, we no longer have any parts for your obsolete racing car. If you would like us to make you a new engine, it will cost $65,000. and that was before even Ferrari Classiche existed. $65,000 was about 10 times what the entire car was worth. So poor Mr. Cornell left his car at the Ferrari factory, and eventually there are some rather more aggressive than pleading letters from Ferrari to him saying, your car has been here under temporary import for 2 years now, will you kindly take it away? So he took the car away, and believe it or not, the car was sold for Ferrari's storage bill and the customs taxes that were owing, which was a grand total, what price a time machine, of $920. Yeah, I wish as well. Anyway, the car found its way back to the... In fact, went to England, went to the States, went to England. Andreas bought it from Seattle about 4 years ago. Paul has done the most meticulous restoration. They even traced Mr. Cornell's widow, who I had the pleasure of meeting last year at Pebble Beach, to make sure that they had the exact correct shade of blue. Andreas was going crazy, taking swatches of blue all over the world to various people who remembered the car from when it was new, to make sure that he got the right shade. The result is the car you see today. One word, fantastic. Grazie. Hello, Charlie. Now, a car that arguably needs no introduction, just 3 letters. GTO. A round of applause for Chris and Ann Cox from North Carolina with the Ferrari 250 GTO. Wow. It's said that Ferrari was worried as to whether the international sporting authorities would homologate his new GT car at the beginning of the 1962 season. And you were supposed to have built 100 cars of any given model in order to homologate it for racing. Ferrari, with a bit of fancy footwork, managed to shuffle around the dozen or so cars that he had built between different warehouses to convince the inspectors that there were actually 100 cars already built. The telegram came from Modena to Enzo Ferrari with just three words after the inspector's visit. It said, Gran Turismo Omologato. The Grand Touring car has been homologated. And those 3 initials stuck, and the result is one of the most successful GT racing cars in history. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, a lot is said these days about the value of GTOs because they are generally considered to be the most precious cars in the world, and every time one sells they set a new record. But ciao Gigi. But much more than that, I have to say, even I thought, how can they really be so special? What is this myth of the GTO all about? Until I was offered the chance to drive one on the GTO tour 6 years ago, when an owner, luckily for me, fell ill, and his mechanic ill-advisedly gave me the keys to the car and said, would you like to drive it tomorrow? And after a few bottles of Dom Perignon, I said yes. Didn't take very long. And I have to say, halfway through the next day, that we started very timidly driving like a grandmother, worrying about every sound. By the end of the next day, we were bombing through France at 220 kilometers an hour thinking, how can I win the lottery? They really are that good. The GTO is the ultimate evolution of the racing car that you can still drive on the road. As you can see, the engine is in the front, which means it doesn't get quite as hot inside as some of the cars where the engine is right up against the back of the driver. The cabin, as a result of that, still has a reasonable amount of room, although 0 in terms of creature comforts. If you see what look like 3 loo roll holders on the dashboard, that's actually the total of the ventilation system. Nothing in the way of carpets, nothing in the way of trim. The metal is all bare. The roof is bare underneath. There's a vague effort at a luggage trunk, just enough to satisfy the racing authorities. And this wonderful chopped-off tail, which increases the aerodynamics. One of the first cars to have a little rear spoiler to keep the back on the ground at speeds approaching 170 kilometers an hour. And then one of my favorite details, the exhaust tips, which have on them something called snaps, which are these large exhaust gas extractors. They have rifling around them, rather like the gun barrel in the Bond movie, which takes out the exhaust more effectively, which is said to give you an extra 5 kilometers an hour top speed on the Mulsanne Straight. These air intakes in the front, you can fill in if it's cold weather. You can take out if you need extra cooling. This one here is to check the water without having to take the entire bonnet off. It's got the absolute classic Ferrari profile of a long, dare I say, almost phallic nose, this low cabin, this chopped off tail. This is sex on 4 wheels.
Exactly, exactly. This is the reason why this car will won the prize for the most iconic car in the event. But I think it's one of the most iconic cars everywhere in the world. There is no question about.
So it wins the prize for the most iconic car.
The prize is offered by
Natalie Franken is awarding the prize. Now, if you're wondering why this car is blue with a yellow stripe when most Ferraris, of course, are red, the reason is very simple. The first owner of the car was Count Volpi di Misurata, the Venetian count, who is still with us today. Count Volpi had upset Enzo Ferrari by backing a rival Formula One team. And so Enzo Ferrari cancelled his order for a Ferrari GTO. Count Volpi got around that by placing the order in a friend's name. Try doing that today. Ferrari won't they'll see through that. But back then, he managed to get the car in a friend's name. After 1 year of racing it, he sold it to a Swedish driver called Ulf Norinder, and Ulf Norinder painted it blue with the yellow stripe. A small anecdote about this car. Its English owner in the 1970s was on a test drive, I believe it was in Kensington High Street, with an American who was interested in buying the car, and they got rammed by a little old lady driving a Morris Minor. I know that sounds like a cliche, but it did happen. If ever there was a lucky accident, that was it, because the American did not buy the car, and the English owner kept it for another 20 years, which was definitely positive for his bank balance. Chris, Anne, thank you very much. Good to see you here.
Another point, Simon,
the
is
Ferrari
all
250 GTO.
That big numbers painted on the body is typical of the Targa Florio.
Yes, absolutely right, Franco. This car raced on the Targa Florio, which was that charismatic Sicilian race, totally chaotic, utterly wonderful. They didn't have fancy stickers with numbers. They just painted them on by hand with white paint, and that was the car's start number on the Targa Florio race. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Anne. Good to see you, and especially good to hear you. Now, the Ferrari GTO really was the end of an era where you could drive a car to the racetrack, win the race, and then drive home again. And Porsche, as much as anybody else, realized that when they introduced this car, the Porsche 904 Carrera GTS. They couldn't call it the 904 in the day because Peugeot had copyrighted all 3-digit car names with a 0 in the middle, so they referred to it instead as the Carrera GTS. Carrera because of the Carrera Panamericana road race in Mexico where Porsche had been so successful. This car had a coupe body rather than the earlier Porsche racing cars, which were normally open, because Porsche realized that on high-speed circuits a closed car was more aerodynamic. One of the other novelties of this car is that it has a plastic body. It's a fiberglass body made by a company called Heinkel that many of you will recognize because of the aircraft that they made in the Second World War, but their biggest client went out of business in 1945, and so they devoted themselves to other pursuits, one of which was the car body. This particular car, first in class, 12th overall at the Le Mans race in 1964, and it's been in the same ownership for 40 years. 40 years in the same ownership, the Porsche 904 Carrera. And as I said, this is the period when race cars and road cars finally diverge. No longer is a car that you can drive on the road likely to be competitive. And so for the first time, owners of these cars, or buyers of these cars when they were new, were invited to come to collect them with a trailer at the Porsche factory. Thank you very much. Dominic Fischlin handing over the prize to Klaus Otto Recker of Germany. the Porsche 904 with, of course, the appropriate registration number. Thank you very much. Now, rounding off this class, we have the 1969 Abarth 2000 Sport SE10 of Marco Confidati from Italy. As you can see, these cars were built for drivers who were the size of jockeys rather than modern-day car collectors. Perfetto, grazie. Marco Confidati dall'Italia con l'Abarth 2000 Sport SE 010. Now this car was one of the final racing cars of Karl Abarth, also known as Carlo Abarth. He was born in Austria. He came to Italy as a young man to work in his family's hotel in Merano. But unlike his father, he intended to go not into the hotel business, but the car business. Karl Abarth loved racing cars. He studied as an engineer, and he got a job with Cisitalia, which was Piero Duzio's racing car concern just after the war. Cisitalia didn't last that long. It went bust. But as part of his severance, Karl Abarth received a number of Cisitalia cars and parts. And he set himself up as a car tuner. He originally sold tuning kits for Fiat Topolinos just after the war in the early 1950s. And then he decided to start making his own cars. But generally speaking, he still used Fiat mechanical components for these cars. Come the 1971 season, and the Fiat group had realized that Abarth, which by then was part of it, that they had a chance of winning that year's rally championship if they could build a car in time for the Tour de Belgique, the race that you can see the sticker of on the nose of this car. They figured that the Lancia Fulvia wouldn't be fast enough, it wouldn't be quick enough, and so they set about preparing this car in record time. They managed to do that. They got the great Sandro Munari, who I'm sure many of you know, perhaps the best-known rally driver of the mid-1970s. They got Munari to drive the car. They thought they had thought of absolutely everything. They started the Tour de Belgique. They led the Tour de Belgique, and then it started to rain. Now, as you can see, there isn't a great deal in terms of weather protection in this car. The co-driver had pace notes that were written on a loo roll, which was all well and good until it started to get wet. And then to cap everything else off, the inside of the car got soaked, the engine bay got soaked, and the one thing that Abarth and the engine bay had not thought to protect was the ignition system. And so whilst they were leading the race, the car came to a grinding halt. But that's racing. Marco has finished racing, restoring this car in record time for Villa d'Este to be here today. We thank you very much for your participation, and I have to say it's great to see this car back in its original livery here today. Grazie, grazie a te. Ciao. Sandro Munari's Abarth Tour de Belgique race car. Now, the next class is called 80 Years of Automotive Archaeology. Now, for this class, what we've tried to do is to show that sometimes it's best just not to touch cars rather than to restore them. Sure, a lot of cars need restoration, they need to be preserved, but at the same time, if you save a car rather than restoring it, that's always got to be the best course of action. It's Duccio Lopresto, Corrado's son, who is driving this 1913 Scat. It's a family outing. Ciao Duccio. No, vai, prosegui pure, vai fino al mosaico. Società Ceirano Automobili Torino. That's what Scat stands for. Puoi spegnere? Spegniamo. Now, what car could better symbolize a preservation class automotive archaeology indeed, than a 105-year-old car that has never been restored from a manufacturer that I'm sure most of us have never heard of. But Scat was a car manufacturer from Turin, and this particular car was delivered new to Sicily, where it was owned by the family of a baron. The first owner of the car was this nobleman, the Sicilian nobleman, and the family owned the car for no fewer than 100 years until 2013. And if you have a look at the car as it comes past on this side, you'll see that in addition to the horn and these wonderful gas lamps and the luggage on the roof and these again gas side lights, one of the best details of this car is that it has rifles mounted on the running boards. And the reason it has rifles mounted on the running boards is not because it was a hunting car. It's because in Sicily in 1913, if you drove the car in the countryside, there was a very good chance of encountering bandits, and you need to be properly prepared. So the Scat was looked after by the nobleman's family for 100 years. After that, it was sold to another collector, and then Corrado Duccio's father, who's a great believer in unrestored cars, he's shown some wonderful examples here in recent years, purchased the car just a few short years ago, and you receive your awards from Ralph, Huber, and Dominic Fischlin. But the Scat really is something extraordinary. To think that this paintwork has survived all that time, and the reason it survived so long is that the family, when they put the car into storage, they covered the whole car in Vaseline, which you simply took off with another type of cream to reveal the original hand-painted lacquer underneath. All the original upholstery, the original woodwork, and we've got the whole family in the back, and they're already taking pictures of the awards that you've been given. Great, thank you very much, Duccio. Grazie a te. Spectacular way to open the preservation class, automotive archaeology. Now, they don't have a conventional starter motor. The starter on this car is powered by air, by very high pressure air. If you think that the tires in your car are pumped up to 2 atmospheres, this car has a pressurized system at 20 atmospheres. Not bad for 1913. This really is. He's about to take out the umbrella. We hadn't. Note to organizers: next time, make provision for cars that are 10 feet tall. Jan de Reur from Belgium with the 1954 Fiat 8V Rapi Berlinetta. Good afternoon, Jan. Great to see you. Now, this car is the sportier bodied version of the Fiat 8V that we saw earlier today. And this was a car that the long-term American owner, Larry Vivian, I think, spotted in a classified advert when he was doing his military service in Germany in the 1950s. Now, this young American businessman bought the car, immediately entered it into a race whilst he was still in Europe. Is that Larry's helmet in the back seat that I see there, Jan? You even have the original driver's helmet. And this American gentleman, Larry Vivian, kept the car for the next 60 years. And you bought it from the family just 5 years ago. This is the Fiat flagship of the early 1950s, a car that you could drive on the Mille Miglia, you could drive it to La Scala, you could drive it to the office. It really was the all-round car. But considering that it cost twice as much as a Jaguar XK120 in the early 1950s, when Fiat was no longer associated with luxury cars, in the end, they only built 114 of these, and it was really the end of Fiat's quest to build an ultra-sporting, ultra-luxury car. Jan is a great connoisseur of 1950s Italian exotica, what we like to call etceterini. Good to have you back with us. Thank you. Only the man who has everything could have a car purely for going from the stern of his yacht to the restaurant and back. And such a man was, of course, the king of the Dolce Vita era, certainly in Italy, Gianni Agnelli. And here we have Simone Bertolero driving his mother and father and Corrado Lopresto's wife. There's something very interesting going on here. In Gianni Agnelli's Spiaggetta, the Agnelli beach car. Look at that. You really have to be somebody very special, then as now, to be able to have a beach car in your garage. Now, Agnelli had two of these cars, in fact. They were kept at his villa, Villa Leopolda in the south of France, one of the most beautiful houses on the Côte d'Azur. And the car was frequently lifted onto Agnelli's yacht for its various trips around the world. It chauffeured people like Onassis, Jackie O, various Hollywood starlets, and various members of the jet set of the 1950s. As one of my friends said earlier today, if car seats could talk, there would have been a lot of action on those seats. The car was kept in the Agnelli family for a number of years. He gave it in the end to his private secretary. This is the man who walked around behind Agnelli paying for things, because Gianni Agnelli, as the wealthiest man in Italy, didn't need to carry money like the rest of us mortals. The car was given to the private secretary, and eventually the private secretary in turn gave it to his chauffeur when he was retiring as a parting gift. It's only done, I think, 16,000 kilometers in some 60-odd years. The only instrument on the car is a speedometer. I can't help but noticing optimistically calibrated to 100 kilometers an hour. And apart from that, all you get is some toweling rear seats, wickerwork front seats, and wooden bumpers. Not the car to venture out in inclement weather, but a very stylish conveyance, if ever there was one. Grazie Simone, non vedo l'ora di vederti domani con tutta la entourage a Villa Erba. Grazie. The Agnelli beach car. Ciao, la spiaggetta, as the Italians like to call them. I never thought I would hear the sound of a Fiat 500 engine on the Mosaic at Villa d'Este, but I'm very pleased that we did. And now from the Agnelli family to the brick king of Sicily. Pietro Lafauci of Messina was the first owner of this car, which is driven here today by Ulf Klenk from Germany. That's great, Ulf. Thank you very much. Just hold it right there. Basta, perfetto, grazie. Pietro Lafauci had to be quite a character, because I know that he had a number of cars in his stable, ranging from Ferraris and Lamborghinis and many other exotic things. He was known as the Brick King of Sicily because of his brick building business. And we were speaking the other day to Joe Nastasi, who's an old Sicilian racing driver and car dealer, and he told me that as a young man, he remembers seeing Lafauci driving every Sunday morning to the bakery to collect his pasticcini in this car. And I have to say, you don't necessarily need an Iso Grifo to get home with your pasticcini still warm for breakfast. Iso, in fact, was a company that came from Bresso, not that far from here, near Milan. Iso started out with the rather improbable background of making refrigerators. That's why the company is called Iso, or was called Iso. It stands for isotherm, the temperature measurement. Iso graduated from refrigerators after the war to making bubble cars in the 1950s after the Suez fuel crisis, when petrol was at a premium and people were looking for cheaper modes of transport. And then, just as improbable as going from refrigerators to bubble cars, they went from bubble cars to supercars by creating this Italo-American hybrid, Italian chassis and bodywork, and a huge, great Chevy V8 5.3-liter engine. The idea was that if you were fed up with your Ferraris and Maseratis, wanted that kind of performance but with no headaches, you would buy an Isogrifo, the griffin, the logo of the company. And they recruited Mr. Bizzarini, the ex-Ferrari designer, to be their chief technician. They even went racing with some success until the company finally went bust in the early 1960s. But if you're looking for the archetypal Italian GT of the late 60s, early 70s, this is it. But what's even more remarkable about this particular car is that nothing on it, from the paint to the tires to the interior, has ever been restored. Good to see you both, you too, Tom. Thanks for sharing the car with us today. I think Mr. Lafauci would be proud. And I hope you go and get the croissants in it on a Sunday morning. Or the bricks. Now here's a car close to my heart, the Lamborghini Miura SV of Andre Friedman from Switzerland. Andre and his brother Alex in the passenger seat. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Merci, Andre. Now, once again, funny enough, we have another car that was, another supercar that was delivered new to Sicily. This, remember, was in the days of, well, in the days before money laundering regulations and all kinds of other things. A lot of very expensive cars were sold to Sicily, and nobody quite asked what the owners did. But I can tell you that the first owner of this car was a man called Mario Loturco. He is still around, and when I met Valentino Balboni this morning, the Lamborghini test driver who remembers the car and the owner very well, I said, what kind of a guy was Mario Loturco? And he said, un tipico siciliano, a typical Sicilian. He was a landowner and a fruit grower. He had olive trees, he had orange groves, very charismatic, drove everywhere at a great rate of knots, apparently. Always asked Valentino to come out and collect the car to take it back to the factory for servicing. But when finally it had a problem with the fuel tank, he decided that the quote to repair it was too expensive, and it sat in his garage for the next 30 years. In the meantime, some fruit trees grew up in front of the garage, and when Andre here, who's a great Swiss enthusiast, found the car and went to buy it, they had to cut down all the fruit trees to get to the car behind it, but I dare say it was worth the effort. The Miura SV, of course, the Miura, the brainchild of Dallara, the famous racing car designer, Gandini, the stylist, Ferruccio Lamborghini, of course, the tractor manufacturer who was offended by Ferrari and decided that he could build his own car better. This was arguably the world's first supercar. You didn't buy it because of practicality, you didn't buy it because of build quality, you bought it because it looked good, it went fast, and it made a hell of a noise, then as now. Merci, André.
Simon, sorry. No, stop the engine, just a minute.
But there's more. It's like
yes,
Colombo. There's just one more thing.
Yes. The last of the special prize of today. This is the Trofeo Auto Design for the most exciting design of the car. The trophy is presented...
Per il design più eccitante, possiamo dire, il trofeo è premiato da...
Premiato da Silvia Barufaldi, the editor of Auto Design magazine, of course.
Donc, tu as gagné le prix pour la voiture, le dessin le plus excitant. C'est approprié pour toi. Donc, bravo, félicitations pour une voiture qui n'a jamais été restaurée. This is a car that has never been restored. Original paint, original interior, just the way we like to see them. Thank you, Andre. And a playboy driving it, as should be the case. Right, we're going to speed it up because we're late, the story of my life, and we're going now to Hollywood on the Lake, stars of the silver screen. And we're starting off with the Delage D8 120. Louis Delage was a racing car pioneer in France in the 1920s. His cars swept all before them on the racetracks. He also built luxury cars, and this is a perfect example. It's the Delage D8. Have you ever seen a bonnet that goes on for longer, has more louvers or more exhaust pipes? It makes even the 540k Mercedes seem conservative in comparison. Richard Adato showing the car, great connoisseur of French car design of the 1930s. The car belongs to the Mullin Motor Museum, and this particular car was built for a motor show at the end of the 1930s. It found its way to America. It was appropriated before then by a French general who sold it to RKO Studios in 1946. And the reason that it's in the Hollywood class is that it was featured in the film Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye with James Cagney, an American in Paris, of course, famous film with Gene Kelly, and then Carmen Jones in 1954 with Harry Belafonte driving the car. I'm told we're late, so I will let you get to the bar, Richard. But great-looking car. Please thank Peter on our behalf for sharing it with us today, after, of course, collecting the participants' medal from Ralph and the certificate from Dominic. This car, by the way, has a great gear change system. When it goes past, try and have a look. It's got something called a Kotal gearbox, where you have a tiny lever next to the steering wheel where you put 1, 2, 3, or 4, but the gear doesn't go in until you push the clutch down, and then it actually engages it. Didn't last very long as a system, but it was very, very clever and makes it much easier to drive. The Delage D8 from the Mullin collection, driven by Richard Adato. The Cadillac Series 62. What do you do if you're one of the most eligible young men in the world and you want to marry one of the most beautiful women in the world? Naturally, you commission a special car and give it to her. And it clearly worked, because I believe that she married him afterwards. Prince Ali Khan was the man in question. Rita Hayworth was the object of his desire. And this is the car that he commissioned and gave to her as a wedding present. It's driven by David and Ginny Sidoric, all the way from Beverly Hills, USA, where this car lives today in the famous Peterson Museum. Good afternoon, David. Ginny, thank you very much for bringing this car all the way from Beverly Hills. I know it's a long way. I know it's not easy. I believe that somebody forgot to bring the keys along the way, but I can see that you're obviously a master at hot wiring. But a great-looking car. This is a wonderful combination, a cocktail of American muscle underneath the hood, underneath the bonnet, and elegant Italian styling, with these chrome moldings down the side, almost the same distance, the bonnet to the cabin as it is from the cabin to the back of the car. You can barely tell whether the engine's in the front or the rear, but all of these details that were very popular at the time. Look at the rear lights, almost like something from a jet fighter. This is the era of supersonic flight for the first time, where everybody was obsessed with breaking the sound barrier and jet fighter design. David, Ginny, I'll let you go. Thank you very much, and see you later on. Now, talking about gifts for beautiful women, have a look at this next car. It's the BMW 507 of 1958, entered by Christian Traber from Bern, Switzerland. Christian, come on down, as I believe they say, because the price is right. Now, Christian is usually seen at the wheel of racing cars rather than road cars. He's a man who likes to drive fast, so he's using all of his self-discipline to drive along at 1 mile an hour in a car. But this is a car with a very special history, and look at that great license plate, Bern 507. This is the actual car that Elvis Presley, that's great, thank you very much, that Elvis Presley gifted to his co-star Ursula Andress back in the period. Now, at the time, Elvis Presley was known for giving his co-stars cars, especially after receiving large paychecks. In the case of Ursula Andress, though, the customary Cadillac just wasn't going to cut it. And she had allegedly said to Elvis, "But I rather like that new BMW." So Elvis gave her this beautiful BMW 507. The one thing that Ursula Andress specified were these different bumpers. Now, as somebody said before, Ursula Andress always did have rather nice bumpers, and I think you'll agree that they look rather good on this particular car. Ralph, Dominic, handing over the prizes. The 507, as we said earlier, is the car that was designed by Graf Goertz, also contributed to the design of the Coca-Cola bottle, Count Goertz. It's a car that was intended originally to compete against Triumph and MG and Austin Healey, and to have a target price of $3,000 when it was introduced in the mid-1950s. Sadly, they missed that target by about $10,000, and the resulting car almost bankrupt BMW. But Thank you very much, Christian Traber with the 507. Today it is considered to be the most iconic, the most beautiful, and certainly the most valuable of all BMW road cars. The BMW 507 of Elvis and Ursula Andress. Now this is a car which needs no introduction, and as if you couldn't guess who the original driver of this car was, the license plate might give it away. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome all the way from the USA, the Aston Martin DB5, driven by Sean Connery in Goldfinger. Let's give it a round of applause, please. The original and sole surviving ex-James Bond, driven by Ohio's answer to James Bond, Harry Yeagy. Good to have you with us on this mission today, Harry. Now, the DB5, of course, is perhaps the greatest example of product placement ever. The producers of the James Bond movies back in the early 1960s were looking for a car for Sean Connery to drive in the upcoming Goldfinger movie. They approached Aston Martin because in the books, James Bond had driven an older Aston Martin, and Aston Martin said, well, we don't really have anything, but I'll tell you what, we could give you an old test car that we don't really have any use for. And so they lent the producers of the Bond franchise a DB5 prototype and a second X demonstration car that they could use for the filming. There were two cars. One car had all the gadgets. It had the machine guns. It had the ejector roof. It's not just the sunroof where they got the design wrong. The bulletproof shield at the back. The oil slick that we will not use today, otherwise we'll never get invited back to Villa d'Este. All the gadgets were featured on one of the two cars, and the other car was used for the driving scenes. So one was used for the close-ups, one was used for the driving scenes. They also built two replicas that were used to tour around movie theaters in the States to produce both Goldfinger, to promote both Goldfinger and Thunderball that came afterwards. Now, the cars after the production, and this seems amazing, after the production was over, both of the cars were stripped of their gadgets and sold just as normal second-hand cars, I believe for approximately £2,000. This car ended up with a radio producer, a radio station owner in the USA, and was sold at auction about 5 or 6 years ago, where Harry bought it. The sister car, which was the car with all the gadgets, was sold at an auction in New York in 1985 and was bought by an American entrepreneur who rented it out for events and so forth until 1990, when the aircraft hangar in Florida where the car was stored was burgled, and the car disappeared in the middle of the night and has never been seen again. The hangar was next to a runway. There are tire tracks from the hangar to the middle of the runway, and then they disappeared. There was a very big insurance payout, but it's speculated that the other car, the only other original Bond DB5, is now sitting at the bottom of the ocean. So this really is the sole surviving Bond DB5. Harry, you brought it all the way from the USA, from Cincinnati. Thank you very much. 007, we're very proud to see it in such an appropriate setting. Now, talking of actors, this next car was purchased new by one of the most iconic actors of the 20th century. Now, if I say to you, do you have a room? You'll probably guess who I'm talking about. Luke, that's wonderful. Now, that man, who was as mad about cars as he was good at acting, was, of course, the late, great Peter Sellers, also known as Inspector Clouseau, a member of the Goons, one of the funniest men alive and one of the best paid entertainers alive in the 1960s, when he walked onto the London Motor Show stand and saw this, currently the most expensive car that money could buy, the Ferrari 500 Superfast, and the clue is in the name. It was indeed the most expensive and the fastest Ferrari that money could buy. So expensive, in fact, that only 36 of them were ever built. The color is known as nocciola, hazelnut, a very typical 60s color that we don't see very often these days. Even Sellers painted the car red for a period, and there's a great shot of him in makeup sitting on the bonnet of the car after filming the film The Party, although, yeah, he didn't leave a dent. But Peter Sellers drove this car extensively with his then wife, Britt Ekland. They drove to Switzerland, they drove to Italy, they drove all over the world in it, and the correspondence in the file between him and Ferrari, complaining about details of the car and arguing about bills of even £30, shows you that nothing changes. Luke, thank you very much indeed. Great to see you. I do love the color as well. Now, tomorrow I expect you to see tomorrow I want to see you in in Inspector Clouseau's raincoat and hat. See you tomorrow. Let's hope it does rain. Now, the last car in this class, just making sure, and indeed it is. This is the penultimate class, by the way, and then I promise I won't talk anymore. The last car in this class is perhaps the most spectacular, which is probably why it's taking a little bit of time to get running. It has been flown here all the way from Beverly Hills. It arrived at midnight last night. It is its first ever Concours appearance, and it is the one-off Lancia Stratos Zero. Please give a warm round of applause for the car entered today by Philip Sarafim from Los Angeles. The Lancia Stratos Zero making its Concours debut 48 years after it was first built. I can't even begin to think how hot it must be in there. Go, 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 bit further, bit further. Philip, I'm going to suggest that you switch it off. Don't worry, we can push it afterwards. Practicality, after all, is so overrated. Philip Sarafim with his co-driver, one or two of you may have heard of, Avril Lavigne, rock star material for a rock star car. And all the way from America, arriving at midnight, the star of the Michael Jackson video Moonwalker, the one-off car that Bertone built in the late 1960s, early 1970s, really as just a show car, but Nuccio Bertone was convinced that this car had a future. And so what did he do? He called Lancia, he said, look, I've really got a car that you should see. Would you please receive me and allow me to show you this car, which I think has great potential if you were to put it into production. Now, Gianbeppe Panico, Gianbeppe, dove sei? Ti ho visto, ecco. Gianbeppe Panico, ciao. Good to see you, ciao. Ciao. Gianbeppe was Nuccio, scusa, spostiamoci di qua. Gianbeppe Panico was Nuccio Bertone's right-hand man at the time that this car was built. Gianbeppe, tell us a little bit. Nuccio Bertone kept on calling Lancia. They refused to see him, so what did you and he do?
Well, we bought a Lancia Fulvia 16 HF, and we tried to manage without saying anything to Lancia, but at the time we were expert in doing mid-engine car like Lancia, Lamborghini Miura, Countach. So Nuccio Bertone and Marcello Gandini decided to use the same 1.6 liter engine and to put it in mid position like it is in this car. This car, in spite of its look and futuristic look, is almost 50 years old. Unbelievable.
And tell me, after you received all of these brush-offs from Lancia saying, we don't want to see you, we're not going to build your car, you had a brainwave. What did you do?
Well, after a few shows, Torino, Brussels, Amsterdam, I drove the car in Brussels under a snowstorm, and they saw many of these pictures all over in a magazine. So Cesare Fiorio and Pierugo Gobbato, they wanted to see the car. we got the car. I was driving the car with Nuccio Bertone close to me, and we went to Lancia Scuderia Corse, which was at the time in Via San Paolo. And when we arrived at the Scuderia San Paolo, as in all factories, we have a sort of a barrier which doesn't allow to get in. When we were there, the people like Cesare Fiorio and Gobbato, they listened the noise of the car, they came out, and suddenly Nuccio Bertone told me, well, you can pass under the bar. So we just went, and so that was the starting of the Stratos story, because 12 months later, we displayed at Torino Motor Show in '71 the final version of the Lancia Rally, which won 4 years consequently the World Rally Championship with Sandro Munari.
So you had been rejected by Lancia, who didn't want to see the car. In the end, they consented to see the car. You and Nuccio Bertone drove this car through the streets of Turin. You got to the Lancia racing department. The barrier was down. Bertone said, go, go, go. You drove right underneath the barrier and into the courtyard. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Exactly, yes. Exactly. That's the story, yes. And then, well, I drove this car a couple of times from on the Autostrada Torino-Milano for the camera car of Quattro Ruote at the time. It was quite exciting and really unbelievable experience.
I have to say, this car, even in 2018, genuinely looks like something from another planet. I can only imagine in 1970 the effect that driving this car down the road must have had. And it's extraordinary that in all of these years, this is the first time the car has ever appeared in the Concours d'Elegance.
Yes, in 1970, it was, we succeeded in going. At the time, you could drive the car in front of the Duomo di Milano. We reached the Duomo, but because of the crowd, because of the people, because of cars, they created such a jam of people and cars that we were unable to go out of that place unless the helicopter of the police and the Vigili Urbani di Milano.
Gianbeppe Panicco, grazie Gianbeppe, sei sempre gentilissimo. Grazie per essere con noi oggi. Philip, Avril, you guys are going to, I have to say, as a special mention, it should be mentioned that Philip, who's a man, he's a man who doesn't do things by halves. He has even commissioned Isaia, the tailor, to design for him and his crew Lancia Stratos Zero suits made out of Stratos Zero fabric. You want one, Simon?
I want two. I want one for each leg.
Like a roller skate. Right, we need to get you out of there. You're going to need a push, I believe. Can we have the service crew, please, can we have the service crew to push the car, or indeed volunteers? Any Michael Jackson or Avril Lavigne fans? Look, they're lining up behind you. Philip, Avril, thank you. See you later on. Simon, you've got a new career beckoning once rock music, if rock music ever goes out of fashion. Olo, it's good to see you too. Right, ladies and gentlemen, we have something very special for you to finish the parade this afternoon. For the first time ever at Villa d'Este, we are going to showcase Formula One, the class that we have called When Sex Was Safe and Racing Was Dangerous. Now, parading this afternoon, we are going to show you 7 Formula One cars. The oldest is from 1954. The youngest is from 1985. We are going to showcase, as the Americans like to say, 3 decades of Formula One. Now, you may have heard the cars warming up earlier. We have available, if you'd like, protective glasses. Just bear in mind that these cars weren't designed to drive slowly, and they are likely to kick up a little bit of gravel. So if you would like earplugs, if you would like protective glasses, just put your hands up, and the young ladies, the pit girls, the grid girls, who are approaching now, will be very happy to hand those out to you. It was quite a long discussion in the selection committee as to whether we were going to have Formula One cars at Villa d'Este. I can't say that it was an easy decision. Practical considerations, you can imagine, weigh heavily on the idea of cars that are designed to do 200 miles an hour in a setting where they shouldn't really be going at more than walking pace. But I'm glad that we prevailed. And I may yet eat those words when none of them start, but optimism reigns eternal, especially in Italy. Kai, are we ready? Let's start the engines, please. Do take advantage. The young ladies with the BMW tattoos are handing out safety equipment. And opening the parade of the Formula One cars, Guillermo Fierro from Spain. Ciao, Guillermo. up to the mosaic. Now, Guillermo is, can I call you a modern-day Alfonso de Portago? He is the definition, the archetype of the gentleman driver. He's not just here in a jacket and tie at the Concours d'Elegance with his car today, but you were racing this car just 2 weekends ago through the streets of Monte Carlo. How was it?
Well, it was great. Always racing Monte Carlo is lovely, and mostly with these cars that in period race there. In a track that has changed a little bit, but still with the same glamour and the same history that Monaco has. So for us, it's always nice to race at Monaco.
Tell me what the Maserati 250F, which you're driving, has the reputation of being one of the best all-round Formula One cars of the 1950s. It's, of course, the same model that won Fangio his 5th and final championship in 1957. What makes the 250F such a nice car to drive, Guillermo?
Well, it's one of those things that you feel more than know what's going on. The fact is that the car is a very neutral car when you drive, so it's very forgiving, very progressive, and therefore very, very pleasant to drive, even when you lose the rear part of the car. So it's a very, very enjoyable car to drive.
Guillermo, thank you very much for coming here. I know that you're definitely not a Concours man. You're more used to being at 7,000 revs in every gear rather than at walking pace. I'm really grateful to you for sharing it with us here today. And the entrance medal and certificate. We didn't really think about where Formula One drivers would put those items, but luckily your lovely wife is here to look after them for you. Nice to see you. Your own personal grid girl. Now, does this car have a starter? It has Steve Hart, who's going to help push. How easy is it to start? If not, we'll just push it off. Quite easy? How easy is... Do we need the bonnet off or not? Well, I tell you what, Steve, let's just push it off here. Let's just push it off from here, and then you can start it just there. And for anybody who thinks that I don't push cars, here's proof to the contrary. Although only about 10 feet. Yeah, I'm only pretending, and I'm definitely not standing behind the exhaust when you do. Thank you, Guillermo. Ciao. Okay, Kai, let's have the next one, please. The 1960 Porsche 718/2 of Oliver Schmidt from Hamburg, Germany. Great to see you and good afternoon. Oliver, how are you? Do you know what? If you think that Formula One cars have to always be small and cramped, then think again, because I was looking at this car when you arrived the other day, and I think even I could fit in here reasonably comfortably. I'm not volunteering, by the way. I'd be useless. I'd be fine at sitting in it, but useless at driving it. But Dan Gurney, who recently passed away, he was well over 6 foot. He was one of the drivers of this car, wasn't he? And you don't often associate Porsche with Formula One. You think about Porsche and sports car racing instead. But in actual fact, between 1957 and 1962, Porsche had their own works factory team. And this particular car raced as a Porsche factory entry before it was sold to Karel de Beaufort, the Dutch gentleman driver, who raced it for no less than 4 seasons in the same car. I mean, the idea, first of all, that a gentleman can race in Formula One seems something somewhat outdated these days, as does the fact that the same car could be reasonably competitive for 4 whole seasons. And then sadly, de Beaufort lost his life in this car in that final season, and the damaged car was then sold by his sister. He wasn't married, like all good playboys. It was sold by his sister through Joe Siffert to Tom Wheatcroft, the Englishman, the North English builder, house builder, who created the Donington collection, the Donington Museum, which is how this car managed to survive in original condition for such a long time. And in fact, if you look inside the car, you'll see that it still has on the left-hand side the dent from Paul de Beaufort's accident. But that's how original the car is. With its skinny wheels, its narrow cockpit, there was zero concession to safety in these days. The driver sat in what effectively was a mobile fuel bomb with the petrol all around him, a roll bar that would barely survive being sneezed upon, and very little else in the way of protection. But great to see a car like that in a setting like this. It's incongruous but utterly wonderful at the same time. Thank you. Now, do you need a push, or do you have a starter? You have a starter. You can come back again. Isn't it great, Oliver? Isn't it great to see? Isn't it great to see, and above all to hear, Formula One cars on the terrace at Villa d'Este? Federico Buratti da Biella con la Lotus di Jim Clark. Now, he's got the absolutely period-appropriate overalls, gloves, and most important of all, the cap, the English farmer's cap, because I should say, sorry, British farmer's cap, because that's exactly what Jim Clark was. He was a farmer from the borders, from Kilmany to be exact, a softly spoken man who could drive a tractor and who discovered that he could drive a racing car even better. And Jim Clark, who died 50 years ago this year in a minor Formula 2 race, was the man who drove this car to victory in no fewer than 3 races out of 4 that he took part in South Africa in the mid-1960s. Now, Colin Chapman was the founder of Lotus. He's a colourful but emblematic figure in the history of sports cars. And to Colin Chapman, we attribute this quote: "Life is like a roll of toilet paper. The closer you get to the end, the faster it goes." Colin Chapman had a lot of rather unusual sayings, and he was a rather quirky man, but it cannot be denied that he was an absolute genius in terms of racing car design. He started out as a driver himself. He then graduated to offering cars that you could build as a kit, and then he started making full racing cars. You could buy the entire car, and he ran a factory team. And Lotus, which of course still exists today, long after Chapman has left us, was one of the great Formula One teams of its era. Colin Chapman wasn't always popular with his drivers because the cars had a habit of braking, usually at the wrong time. But Colin Chapman also said that if nothing brakes on the car, then it means it's too heavy. The other acronym is that Lotus, amongst aficionados, stands for loads of trouble, usually serious. But despite that, they were absolute giant-killing racing cars. This particular car, raced by the late, great Jim Clark, is a perfect example of racing car technology in the early 1960s. Cigar-shaped bodywork, no spoilers yet, the aerodynamics weren't yet a consideration. The idea was to keep the frontal section of the car as narrow as possible. Nobody had thought of wider wheels, and the rules only allowed for a 1.5-litre engine, so they are absolutely jewel-like. As you can see, you do not want to have an accident in one of these cars. Driver safety hadn't even been thought of yet. but they are beautiful in their construction and their scale. Federico, grazie. BRM, British Racing Machines. Here we go into the 1970s, and who better to drive a car from the 1970s? The man with the sideburns, Egon Zweimüller. The man driving this car could not have had no sideburns, so you are the perfect choice. It looks like the airbox is about to suck your hair up into it, Egon. Here we're very much in the era that this class is all about, when sex was safe and sex was safe and racing was dangerous. These cars were not for the faint-hearted. You can see that 10 years have gone by since the Lotus beforehand. We've now got spoilers, we've got far wider wheels. This is the first year of the snorkel, which sucked air into the engine to increase the power. It also happens to be the first car that was sponsored by Marlboro in Formula One, a force for many, many years, as we'll see from the other cars that are going to follow. BRM was a British concern. It was owned at the time by Louis Stanley, Dominic Fischlin, Ralph Huber, handing over the prizes to Egon for the BRM P180. You can see that now the radiator of the car is no longer in the front. This allows the front of the car to be lower and flatter and more aerodynamic. The radiators have moved to the side of the car. As I said before, this snorkel, which was something very distinctive in the mid-1970s, has made its appearance. Everybody else was using it a few short years later. But people like Beltoise, Ganley, and even the young Niki Lauda enjoyed races in this very car. Egon, can you start it? Of course. That's a bold boast. I take it back. Thanks, Egon. Egon Zweimüller with the BRM P180. Now, Ken Tyrrell was a timber merchant originally who decided that he too would like to go Formula One racing. This was the era when those quixotic dreams were still possible. Ken Tyrrell's cars in the 1970s won world championships for Jackie Stewart, amongst others. And then in the mid-1970s, he had a bright idea. Why not fit 6 wheels rather than 4? This, ladies and gentlemen, the Tyrrell P34 is the result, and it is driven by Pierluigi Martini from Italy, Formula One driver himself, and today a collector and historic race car driver. Pierluigi Martini al volante della Tyrrell P34 a 6 ruote. Pierluigi, tu sei un pilota degli anni 90 piuttosto, cosa fai con una macchina degli anni 70?
Ho voluto provare l'emozione degli anni 70 e li ho trovati giusti. Una macchina molto bella da guidare, molto facile e anche molto veloce.
Come cambia questa macchina rispetto a quelle sulla quale hai corso tu?
È una macchina dove hanno trovato l'ottimizzazione massima della meccanica, quindi lavora meno l'aerodinamica ma molto bene la meccanica, quindi è una macchina molto confortevole, molto precisa negli inserimenti delle curve, e poi anche quando gli dai potenza è molto ben bilanciata e quindi è un mix perfetto per divertirsi.
E che questa idea delle 6 ruote funziona?
Quest'idea delle 6 ruote avrebbe funzionato, ma non hanno continuato lo sviluppo delle gomme anteriori e quindi questo è stato, diciamo, l'handicap più grande per ottenere il campionato del mondo, perché questa macchina ha vinto un gran premio, è arrivata 8 volte seconda e 4 volte terza, quindi aveva un ottimo potenziale, però purtroppo lo sviluppo delle gomme anteriori è stato limitato e questo ha creato praticamente l'handicap della macchina.
So Pierluigi Martini, who's a Formula One driver of the 1990s himself, said to me, I asked him, why is a 1990s Formula One driver driving a 70s Formula One car? What drew you to this car? And he said, I loved the idea of something a little bit more organic, a car where the mechanicals rather than the aerodynamics are the overriding driving force, if we can call it that, of this car. It's a car, he says, which is comfortable, which is easy to drive, and which is more forgiving than some of the later cars. I then asked him, this idea of the 6 wheels, does it work? And he said to me, well, it would have worked if they'd actually continued with the tire development. But at the time, there weren't enough people making tires of that size. It seems like a very banal thing, but if only one car on the grid needs tires of that size, there's not much of an incentive for the manufacturer to create them. They didn't pursue that idea, and it ended there after a year or two. I have to say that a few years ago in my business, we were handling the sale of a road car with 6 wheels rather than 4. And I called up Jay Leno and I said, Jay, is this something for your collection? He said, you know what, Simon? It's a bit like a woman with 4 nipples. Interesting, but not really necessary. Pierluigi, grazie. Ti ringrazio per aver portato qui questa eccezionale vettura. Grande piacere. Grazie a te. So as you can see, as we move forward in time, starting these cars gets more and more complicated. You need the whole starting pack. But eventually we get there. Apparently Ken Tyrrell, when his 6-wheeler cars came first and second, said that he wanted the prize money for third as well, because he put 12 wheels over the line, not 8. Thank you for that nugget, Julius. And now, Kai, if we can have the next car, the 1982 Alfa Romeo 182, driven at the time by Bruno Giacomelli and Andrea De Cesaris. Now, Andrea De Cesaris, who died not that many years ago, was a meteoric driver who enjoyed some success but never actually won a Grand Prix. On the other hand, his teammate was a little bit luckier, and I happen to have the good fortune of having him here today with me. Bruno Giacomelli, benvenuto a Villa d'Este.
Grazie, grazie. Buongiorno a tutti.
Cosa ci racconti di questa vettura con la quale tu hai corso per primo?
Sì, questa è una vettura che fu progettata da Gérard Ducarouge, un progettista francese che venne assunto dall'ingegner Kitty, ed è una macchina, la macchina che insieme alla McLaren utilizzò il telaio di carbonio.
Telaio in carbone, quindi dicevi?
Il telaio di carbonio venne utilizzato appunto dall'Alfa Romeo e dalla McLaren per primi in questa stagione 1982.
E questo era il grande ritorno dell'Alfa Romeo alle corse dopo che non avevano corso dal 51 nella Formula 1.
Esatto, nel 1951 l'Alfa Romeo smise di correre in Formula 1, io nacqui l'anno dopo nel 1952 ed ebbi l'onore di riportarla alle corse di Formula 1 nel 1979.
E il punto debole di questa macchina, che non ha ovviamente vinto il campionato, qual era?
Sì, questa vettura nello specifico fece una pole position nel Gran Premio degli Stati Uniti a Long Beach, appunto nel 1982, e con la stessa macchina io feci il terzo tempo al Gran Premio di Monte Carlo, che si correrà domani. È una coincidenza, ma devo dire che era una macchina, un'ottima macchina. E il tallone d'Achille, se si può dire effettivamente di tallone d'Achille, è stata l'affidabilità, perché effettivamente l'Alfa Romeo dopo soli 3 anni dal ritorno alle gare di Formula 1 si ritirò un'altra volta, e dunque non ci fu il tempo veramente necessario per raggiungere l'affidabilità necessaria per poter fare dei risultati, dei grandi risultati.
E correggimi se dico giusto, Andrea De Cesaris era in testa con questa macchina al Gran Premio di Monte Carlo quando all'ultimo giro ha finito la benzina.
Sì, il Gran Premio di Monte Carlo dell'82, dove io partii terzo sulla griglia di partenza, fu un Gran Premio che è ricordato ancora oggi perché ci furono diversi leader della corsa che finirono per ritirarsi per un motivo o per un altro. Andrea ha avuto la possibilità di vincere il Gran Premio, però finì la benzina e si ritirò a pochi giri dalla fine.
So Bruno Giacomelli was just talking about racing this car. He said that the real problem in the period is that they just did not develop it enough. It was never reliable enough. Alfa Romeo came back to racing after almost 30 years to come back into Formula One. They just didn't have the budget. There was too much in the way of politics, and the car never fulfilled its potential because it was just underdeveloped. Andrea De Cesaris, who was one of the drivers who had the greatest number of Grand Prix participations to his credit without ever winning a Grand Prix in his career, was leading the Monaco Grand Prix in this car when on the last lap he ran out of fuel. And Long Beach.
And he led the race in Long Beach for a while before he crashed into the wall, but the car was a great car. And
I have to say it sounds great with the 12-cylinder engine, with the Marlboro livery.
It's a V12, 12-cylinder, 3-liter, and it runs at the time at 13,000 revs.
13,000 revs. That's going to give the hotel management a nightmare. Bruno, ti ringrazio.
Grazie a voi, grazie.
E grazie per l'Alfa Romeo.
Un grazie anche a Aldo Baroli, proprietario dell'auto,
grazie,
che l'ha portata
grazie
qui
a
a
lei.
Villa d'Este.
Complimenti. E lui fa parte della storia della macchina. Thank you very much. I'm going to see. I think we're going to push this one away. Quite to start, it's quite complicated. Yeah, we have seen. So let's push it away, please. Gently on the spoiler. That's fantastic. Bruno Giacomelli, grazie. È stato un piacere. Grazie a te. It's not often that we get to have the original driver with the car to tell us all about it, but poor Andrea De Cesaris was an unlucky man, and that was the actual car in which he led the Monaco Grand Prix before running out of fuel. But as you can see, smoking may be bad for you, but it's very good for sponsorship of Formula One cars. It paid a lot of money, and the cars look great in the livery. And it seems appropriate that to round off that class is the 1985 McLaren MP4 2B, owned by Gerhard Berger of Austria. I have to say, Gerhard, you look different from the last time I saw you. It's the hair. No, it's Paul Lanzante showing the car on behalf of Gerhard Berger. Gerhard can't be here. He's in, I think, Monaco for the Grand Prix. But perhaps more important than that, Gerhard cannot actually fit into his own car because he's too tall. This is the very car that the professor, Alain Prost, took to the Formula One World Championship in 1985. It's the car that he won. Paul, how many races did Alain win in this car in 85? Can you remember? 5, but when he got disqualified. Why did he get disqualified?
A fuel technicality.
A fuel technicality. That was said like a true Frenchman. And then, of course, the car was in the Donington Museum for years and years, wasn't it? It was John Barnard, the chassis designer, and then Gerhard bought it from John.
John, yeah. Then Gerhard sold and then bought it back again.
I seem to remember that, funnily enough, yes. Yes, yes. We won't go into that. Tell me, how difficult is it to drive a car of this age and power along Villa d'Este's terrace at 1 mile an hour?
I was a bit shocked, actually, because it's quite smooth. It's got a lot of bottom-end torque, a lot of clutch control. It's beautiful, really easy.
Are you saying that anybody here that could fit into it could drive it?
Anybody.
That sounds like it might be for sale again. Paul, I'm really grateful to Gerhard for sharing this with us today. I'm grateful to you for bringing it along. How do you want to drive it on from here after you've collected your participants' awards? Are we going to try and start it again? Yeah. All right, well, should we try and do that? Take from Dominic, if you would, your participant's medal and the certificate, just to show Gerhard that you really did bring the car here. So that was the professor's office in the 1985 season. I have to say, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of room there, and I can't help but notice that the driver's feet are actually ahead of the front axle. This is not really a car that you want to have an accident in, is it? If you can't compare it to the Formula One cars of today, 33 years later, it's chalk and cheese. Now, what are you doing? Just explain to us, what are you doing on the steering wheel there now?
Ignition on, electric pump on. Once it starts, you switch the electric pump off because the mechanical pump takes over.
This is probably my cue to get out of the way.
Okay.
I just love the idea that you sit in your car, you put your hand up like that, and somebody starts the engine and away you go. Wonderful. Now we have the car to close the parade, the BMW 503, I believe it is. And then we are going to reveal to you, so don't go away quite yet, we're going to reveal to you before the end of today the winner of the Coppa d'Oro Villa d'Este. Now that is the prize that you, the public, have voted for today as your favorite historic car. That's a prize voted by referendum. Just before the historic car is revealed, we're going to let Ralph Huber, Natalie Franken, Mr. Julius Baer, Mr. Lange und Söhne, Wilhelm Schmidt, we're letting them parade through in the BMW 503, the car that back in the 50s, if you had children that wanted to travel with you, you didn't want a 507, you bought one of those instead. Now, I believe, Franco, mi dirai se siamo pronti per svelare la prossima macchina,
Yes.
l'ultima macchina,
Yes, we are ready
che
to...
sarà praticamente il best of show votato dal pubblico.
Exactly, the referendum. The first thing is that we have to say that it scores double the heat of the second.
Explain that one to me again. Okay, so the car that we're about to see, and I have no more idea which car it is than you, this is the car that the public voted for as their favorite, and it won hands down. It received twice as many points as the second place car. And the winner is the Alfa Romeo 33 Stradale. And luckily it stops. The winner of the 2018 Coppa d'Oro Villa d'Este is the Alfa Romeo 33 Stradale, owned by Rita and Albert Spiess. Complimenti Albert, la tua macchina, complimenti Rita, ha vinto il premio votato dal pubblico per la macchina che a loro è piaciuta di più. E per di più ti dirò che questa macchina ha ricevuto il doppio dei punti, il doppio dei voti della macchina in seconda posizione. Quindi non è solo una vittoria clamorosa. Complimenti. And by the way, when he gets out to receive the prize, take a photograph of the fact that he's not wearing any shoes. You paid 17 million lira back in 1968 for one of these, and you didn't even get air conditioning. Albert, se tu e Rita volete scendere, Ulrich Knips ha un premio per te, Danilo Zucchetti. Rita, scendi anche tu. Beautiful or brutiful? Vieni, Rita. Gentlemen, if you'd like to face the photographers. Complimenti, Albert.
No, grazie, Simon. Grazie a te.
Complimenti. If you all go back a little bit, I'm sure you'll get a better picture with a bit of distance. Just move yourselves back a little bit if you would, please. That's it. That's perfect.
It's okay.
I think it's okay, yeah. Thank you. So this is the traditional Coppa d'Oro, awarded here for, well, since 1929, Danilo. Ulrich Knieps, the head of BMW Mobile Tradition. Danilo Zucchetti, the managing director of Villa d'Este. Giving, look, if you can have a look over this side as well for Francesco and his crew, awarding you the Coppa d'Oro Villa d'Este. This is the prize voted by everybody here. It's really the people's award, and as we say in English, you have won it by a country mile. Hai vinto, stravinto, Albert. Vuoi dire qualche parola della macchina? Dimmi l'emozione che pensi, che emozione senti?
A me piace molto il disegno di questa macchina scaglione, questo è veramente fantastico. Anche il motore con di 8 cilindri, 8V, fantastico.
Tu sei di solito un uomo Lamborghini. L'Alfa Romeo per te cosa rappresenta in confronto alla Lamborghini?
Alfa Romeo ha una grande storia, vince quasi tutto. Invece Lamborghini non c'è la storia per racing.
Lamborghini è cafe racer, questa è più vero racer. Tutti e due hanno il loro interesse. E come riesci a guidare la macchina? Perché tu sei abbastanza alto, Albert.
Sì, non è molto comodo e la frizione è molto duro.
Ah, sì?
Ma sì, si può fare così.
E dentro fa molto caldo?
Oh, sì, si vede.
No, devo dire che tu sei a posto, però mi immaginavo di più.
Sì.
E questa macchina è mai stata esposta in un concorso di eleganza prima di oggi?
No, mai. La prima volta qui.
E la macchina era del concessionario Alfa Romeo di Roma, vero?
Si vede.
C'è ancora, have a note that there's still the sticker of the original supplying dealer of this car, the Alfa Romeo dealer of Rome, in the rear window. So do take a photograph of that afterwards if you get a chance. But Albert was saying, I said to him, how difficult is it to drive this car? He said, it's quite hard. The clutch is either in or out and there's nothing in between. It's very hot inside the car. But he said, it just sounds so great. It's such fun. And as I believe all Italians know, you have to suffer to be beautiful.
Grazie.
Grazie a te, Albert. Grazie a te, Rita. I have to say, I'm not surprised. It's the car that, if I could fit in it and if I could afford it, it's the car that I would take home. Grazie a te, Albert. E grazie a te, Rita, anche.
Grazie.
So to the victor, the spoils. Certainly one of the best looking cars ever built. Franco Scaglione is the man who designed the coachwork. He was relatively little known. He came from Florence. He died in obscurity in the 1990s, but he was responsible for some of the greatest designs in Italian history. He designed the first Lamborghini. He designed the Alfa Romeo Giulietta Sprint. But arguably his absolute masterpiece was this car, the 33 Stradale, a car that cost 9.7 million lira when it was new in the late 60s. Alfa Romeo claimed to have made 18 of them. Only 10 are known to have ever been built, totally unrestored. 700 kilometers from new. He has one or two nice Alfa Romeos in his collection. But I have to say, as a car designer, this is about as good as it gets, isn't it? Sex on wheels. The best of the best, yep. I think many people here would agree with you on that. There isn't a line out of place on this car, is there? You don't want to touch anything. And so many cars in the recent past have been inspired by the design of this car. I think at that point, Alessandra, possiamo dire che la sfilata è chiusa. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to let Albert and Rita drive their beautiful 33 Stradale away. Even Simon Le Bon says good choice, gives thumbs up. That's the dogs, isn't it? One of your favorites? Don't ask about practicality when you can only open one door at a time. Hey, it's Italy. Who cares, right? Mark Newson, the designer's opinion?
Favorite car. I love it.
You love it. Even Mark Newson says he loves it. And he wants it. I'll notice that. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. This has been the 2018 Concorso di Eleganza Villa d'Este. See you next year. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Grazie a tutti. All'anno prossimo. Thank you very much. Kai, well done. Well done with the Formula One cars.
You did a great job. You made it to the event.
Thank you very much. You're very kind. Thank you.